Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for joining us today on SBI International Webinar on Nuclear Deterrence and Strategic Stability in South Asia. I'm Ayusha Khan, Associate Director at Strategic Vision Institute, Islamabad. First of all, I would like to extend my profound gratitude to our esteemed panelists, discussants, and especially the audience to joining us today, despite your busy schedules or in case of international experts, despite the time differences. Nuclear deterrence in South Asia as a bedrock concept of strategic stability between Pakistan and India has variably been under a varying degree of stress. So the main aim of today's webinar is to discuss those underlying causes and objectives. Moreover, it was also aimed to contribute to the national and international discourse on regional stability, nuclear deterrence, strategic stability, a debate on this particular topic. For this purpose, today we have an excellent panel lined up. First of all, Dr. Executive Director SVI will be sharing his introductory remarks. First session today is on global strategic environment and the great power competition, where Mr. William Elberg, Professor Gu Zuitan, and Ambassador Zamir Akram will deliver their presentation. And then I will open the session for discussant remarks and question and answer session. Our second session today is on crisis escalation, nuclear deterrence, and doctrinal shift in South Asia. We have four South Asian experts, including Dr. Ali Ahmed, joining us today from India, Dr. Mansoor Ahmed, Dr. Adil Sultan, and Dr. Nasir Hafiz will be sharing their views. Before inviting Dr. Naeem Salek for his introductory remarks, I have a few requests to make. The views and opinions expressed in this event are those of the views of the SVI. It is an open house event and will be reported in print and electronic media. The event is already live streamed on the SVI Facebook page, and complete recording of the event will be available on the SVI YouTube channel. After the presentation from speakers, first I would like to request to discussants to share their views. If you have any question, you can pose to the speaker. But it is requested from our discussants that please be brief in your questions and try to wrap them in 2 minutes. I'll be grateful. And then I will take requests from our virtual participants, from whom I would like to request that please use Q&A box to type your questions and also mention your name and affiliation. Now, without further ado, I would like to request Dr. Naeem Salek, Executive Director, Strategic Vision Institute, to deliver his remarks. Sir, please, over to you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I would also like to very warmly welcome all the participants of this webinar, those who are virtually with us, as well as those who are physically present in this room. It's indeed a great pleasure to us. We have a very eminent panel of experts in both sessions, and therefore it makes my job easy because I don't have to speak much. I would rather myself be learning from the expertise of the panelists we have. Just to set the ball rolling, I would just like to make a few remarks. Although the title of today's event is Nuclear Deterrence and Strategic Stability in South Asia, but as we are all aware that we all live in a global world, so everything is interlinked, and whatever is happening in South Asia cannot be isolated with the developments which are taking place around the world. And as the title of the first session suggests, global strategic environment and great power competition, we have seen that after a hiatus of few years, after the end of the Cold War, the great power competition has been re-energized in recent times. But it is not the two-way competition as we witnessed during the Cold War. Now there are multiple poles in this. And as is evident from the recent document released by the United States government as their national security strategy, they have identified two major powers, Russian Federation as the immediate threat, and China as the long-term future threat. So there is a triangular competition amongst the major powers, with alignments and realignments taking place and new arrangements like Quad and AUKUS and all these kind of new arrangements propping up. We also see the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, its fallout effects, not only on the European security, but global security as well. And not to mention the effects on the international economic environment. So we have to take account of all these things once we narrow down our focus to the situation in South Asia. And as we know, South Asia has been a region which has been crisis prone, and the stability in South Asia has been a tenuous one with recurring crises. And the danger with these crises is that although we know that both India and Pakistan are supposed to be responsible states, but yet in these crises, because of unintended consequences of certain actions and decisions taken by the decision makers on either side, there is always that possibility of unintended or inadvertent escalation during these crises, which has to be guarded against. And I won't go any further, and I would hand it back to Ms. Ayusha to continue with the proceedings of the event today.
Thank you, Dr. Salek. Ladies and gentlemen, today our first session is on global strategic environment and great power competition. Our first speaker for the first session is Mr. William Elberg. He is the Director of Strategy, Technology, and Arms Control Program at the International Institute of Strategic Study Europe office in Berlin, focusing on national security strategy, nuclear deterrence and non-proliferation, arms control, risk reduction, and international security. He previously served as the director of the NATO's Arms Control, Disarmament, and Weapons of Mass Destruction Non-Proliferation Center, ACDC, and worked for the US government for more than 2 decades. So without any further ado, I would like to request Mr. William Elberg to please share his views with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. I'm honored to address you all today and to talk about the global strategic environment and the return to great power competition. As you heard, one of the most important recent developments that we've had in strategic stability is the launch of the new US reviews, the nuclear posture review, their national security strategy, and missile defense review all at the same time in October. This comes in the context of the war in Ukraine, which continues to rage as a nuclear weapons state. Russia is waging a horrific war, a long, grinding land war against a non-nuclear weapons state, its neighbor, in the context of nuclear weapons threats on a regular basis. We also have the recent missile incident, the BrahMos accident, which occurred earlier in the year. We have the discovery of new Chinese missile silos and the successful mating of sub-launch ballistic missiles onto Chinese submarines, brand new J3 SLBMs. We have the launch of the Australia, UK, US relationship, including sharing technology to build nuclear submarines, as well as other potential areas of cooperation, outer space, other advanced technologies. The launch of the new Quad, which includes the US and India, in an effort to pull India away from its alliance with Russia. UK posture review, and then in 2020, President Macron's nuclear weapons speech and other subsequent speeches that he's made. We have clashes between China and India. So it's been a very busy return to great power competition sort of across the board over the past few years. And this has caused a lot of instability in regional relationships as well. We have in the Middle East the real possibility of a proliferation cascade as Iran has exceeded its JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action Agreement, to limit its nuclear potential. It has highly enriched uranium to U-235 to 60%, more than one significant quantity of 60%, which previously had been thought to be a red line that other countries would not accept. Israel has had a return to a government which had drawn a lot of those red lines, and so there's a lot of unease in that region. Will Iran go all the way to develop its own nuclear arsenal, and will that set off the Gulf states to build their own nuclear potentials, a hedge, as it were? In the meantime, in East Asia, with North Korea's unconstrained nuclear program continuing, not only building strategic nuclear forces, but greatly enhancing its regional and tactical nuclear weapons capabilities. That also has set off a reaction in South Korea. The United States lifted South Korea's limits on missile production, which had existed since the late 70s. Now South Korea's conventional missiles can be built to any range, and hints that it may be building missiles with very high precision to 4,000 kilometer range, as well as becoming the first non-nuclear weapon state to successfully launch sub-launched ballistic missiles. The return of the ballistic missile as a regular feature of warfare. Ballistic missiles back in the Cold War were considered far too inaccurate to be successfully used in the tactical battlefield, but advances in high precision has now meant that ballistic missiles have been used regularly in combat by Russia in Syria. They were used in between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and now they're being used widely by Russia in its war on Ukraine. Ballistic missiles previously, because they were so inaccurate, were tied in the ideas of many countries with nuclear weapons, but if they are going to be very capable conventional weapon delivery platforms, we now have to worry once again about ballistic missile proliferation alongside cruise missile proliferation. Countries with conventional and nuclear, meaning that we have what we call entanglement, the fear that a missile coming your way could be nuclear or conventional armed, but regardless, it being of such high precision that it could have a strategic effect and destroy your command and control, which puts everyone on edge. Competition in outer space is proceeding apace, with the United States first developing anti-satellite capabilities back in the 70s and 80s, the Soviet Union following closely, Russia and China picking up the mantle of space weapons, building co-orbital weapons as well as direct anti-satellite attack capabilities, directed energy capabilities, and other strange and unique anti-satellite blinding or damaging capabilities, as well as full destruction capabilities, while at the same time sort of hypocritically asking everyone to prevent the first placement of weapons in outer space, when we know very well they've already placed and tested many, many weapons in outer space. India also demonstrating the capability for a direct ascent anti-satellite capability. This has all pushed the United Nations into agreeing to an effort to try to limit the space race through an open-ended working group trying to talk about rules and behaviors. So at least we can have some sort of basic rules of the road, as we do on the high seas and over the high seas, to try to prevent incidents from escalating out of control. Outer space obviously being a place where all the nuclear weapons states rely on satellite capabilities for early warning of sneak attack by the countries that they're worried about. And as our opening speaker pointed out, this is not the Cold War. In the Cold War, the US and the Soviets had such predominance in outer space, on the high seas, over the high seas, on land, in the nuclear realm, that it really was a bilateral nuclear competition, even though there were many, many conflicts all around the world and China was seen as somewhat of a threat. Now you have China unconstrained by any arms control whatsoever, no even self-imposed limits on its production of fissile material or warheads. The only member of the P5 with no even rhetorical limit on its ability to build up its nuclear arsenal, and the revelation that it is building a tremendous amount of force for a triad that is ICBM, sub-launch ballistic missiles, and heavy bombers that are nuclear capable, in addition to shorter range and medium range dual capable systems. We have a hub and spoke deterrence cascade, if you will. So Russia versus the US versus China, China versus India, India versus Pakistan, and in there, North Korea and Iran, all setting off sort of sub-arms races in their regions. This is an incredibly difficult and dangerous situation, and one that the world has never faced before. We have revisionist and ethno-nationalist states threatening their neighbors. We have huge amounts of mistrust. We have the UN Security Council, which is assigned to the role of upholding peace and security in the world, not working together at all, and many countries around the world trusting the UN Security Council less and less. And so as we move from a Cold War deterrence, which relied on a balance of terror, to this new hub and spoke deterrence relationship, where two countries deterring each other end up setting off an arms race with someone else. At the same time, we have open source information technologies in the way that we've never seen before. The ability for regular citizens to log on and look through satellites that previously only the CIA and KGB could ever dream of having, means that we have a pretty good idea of how many nuclear weapons different countries are having. We can watch proliferation occurring in real time. We can see countries deploying their armies. Countries watching the war between Ukraine and Russia with a degree of clarity that is just incredible. This also can threaten stability, as countries used to rely on the ability to hide some of their moves in order to deter the other side, knowing that only the US and the Soviets could see each other's moves. Now, if everyone can see everyone's moves, and as I said, with the hub and spoke arms race, US and Russian moves then set off China, which sets off India, which sets off Pakistan, and so on and so on. Impatience with this new era of hub and spoke deterrence has fed into what we call the ban treaty, the nuclear ban treaty. Countries who just want to skip ahead of all of this and get right to nuclear disarmament at a time when none of the states with nuclear arms are in any way interested in suddenly unilaterally dropping their weapons just because some other states say that they should. This is a very difficult situation because some ban treaty advocates, especially in the NGO world, are saying that we should abandon the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has served to rather successfully limit the arms race for the past 50 years. And you might say, well, not that successfully. But remember in 1970, when the NPT was signed, there was a real fear that there would be 25 nuclear armed states by the 1980s. And that's not happened. We still have relatively limited, relatively slow arms race, but it is increasing. And I think the way to limit that further and to try to manage it is not to abandon the NPT and jump into an unverifiable and untested treaty among countries that don't really have security conundrums, but rather to double down on the NPT, to work together and try to find solutions. Bilateral arms control may be going away. The US and the Russians look no closer to negotiating a new START, which will end by law in February 2026 with no chance for extension. Negotiations are not underway and are unlikely to be underway while Russia continues its war on Ukraine. And there are increasing noises from Russia that look like it's not interested in extending or renegotiating a new treaty. China has refused any arms control with the United States until the US and Russia come down to very, very low levels, while at the same time China's building up. It's a dangerous situation. Is there a pathway back? I think it's actually unlikely without a new Cuban Missile Crisis. I think with Russia and China still pursuing very revisionist policies, with ethno-nationalism coming to the rise in so many different countries, I think we're going to need, unfortunately, a shock to get us back to the idea that we need arms control, that we need stability, that we need peace. So we have a very difficult few years to get through. I hope we don't have a Cuban Missile Crisis, but again, I think it might be the only way to return to arms control. In the meantime, we live in a new arms race. And can we survive it? Can we find the will and the intelligence to survive it? I hope we can. There are some ideas out there. There are some regional dialogues that are worth fostering, but it will be dark. And in the meantime, we'll need all the help we can. So I hope the UN Open-Ended Working Group on Outer Space can work. I hope there's some way China can find a way to engage in arms control. I hope India can find a way to talk to Pakistan and try to find stability and peace. but it'll be a very, very difficult few years. So with that very cheery final note, thank you very much for letting me talk here today.
Thank you so much, Mr. William. That was, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. William Albert speaking on the global strategic environment and contemporary power competition, impact and implications. Thank you so much. Now I would like to request Dr. Gu Zuitang, Professor of International Relations in Law School of Shanghai, University of International Business and Economics in Shanghai, to deliberate on the topic strategic stability in Asia Pacific, risk of escalation. He is the director of Center for South Asian and Indian Ocean Studies and also in charge of the Institute of International Strategy and Policy Analysis as well. He holds a PhD in international relations from Fudan University. His main areas of interest are China's national development strategy and foreign policy, the South Asian security and geopolitics, etc. Over to you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Can anybody hear me? Is okay?
Yes, we can all hear you. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. And I appreciate the invitation of the Strategic Vision Institute. It's a good opportunity to join this webinar. I think it's the topic not only about the nuclear deterrence or nuclear stability, but also how we view this strategic vision or strategic landscape in the next year and in the future, particularly in Asia Pacific, or we have another narrative is Indo-Pacific. So there are, I agree with the former speaker of ISIS, the risks, there are many risks of escalation in the next year. I think I agree totally with him. I'm not optimistic to the, I think particularly next year. I think there are so many problems, like and in China and USA, this is the main, I think the mainstream of great power competition. It can't be on a new vision of other multilateral or bilateral great power relationship, like the China, US, India, China, US, Russia, and even the China, India, Pakistan, China, Russia, India, US, Russia, India. There are many great power now involved in this kind of strategic involvements, like also the European, like the EU, excuse me, like the EU, the Germany, the France, and UK. They also affect this kind of not military direction of the great power competition, but also the economic and trade, the shifts of the international competition from the bilateral trade to the supply chains, even in the Southeast, in East Asia, and from the from Southeast Asia to Southeast Asia. So this kind of changing now, we have seen these kind of changes and kind of these instabilities happens in the past year, but we are looking forward more from my point of view, even now see like China, US military conflict, even we can say over Taiwan Island, but also that like the China-India border disputes. So there are many like I think instabilities in the future. So there's one more I like to just add is in East Asia, like the Germany and France, UK, and also they are making more like we call in China they call the small NATO. We call the small NATO or Asian NATO with Japan, with India, with Australia. There are small more military alliance counterbalancing China's military power in East Asia. So and under this kind of circumstances, you can see also another, I will just add to Mr. William Albuquerque's points that I see more and more nuclear deterrence, nuclear competition in East Asia, in South China Sea, over the Taiwan Islands, like the US and Russia, US, Australia, British is the AUSCUS. There's more nuclear deterrence. The US doesn't even launch long-distance strategic missiles in Asia Pacific. So you can see this kind of a traditional military competition, and with the nuclear deterrence, the traditional nuclear deterrence, both now increasing. So we can see this is I think from my point of view, is a trend. At the same time, the bilateral and multilateral competition also exists. China-US relation competition, it's not just bilaterally, it's multilaterally. China-India also the same. China, Germany, China-Russia relationship also multilaterally. So this is much more complicated, and I think is further happening in the future. Let me focus more about China-US relationship now. Everyone knows that the US, Asia, India, they call the Indo-Pacific strategy. It's kind of mainly from Chinese view is version is the counter is trying to contain China. Even they don't use the contain the word, the containment strategy, but also it's you can see it's a new Cold War kind of phenomenon inside. But there are also new Cold War some elements inside. There are China-US trade relationship. You can see much more intense, and we cannot find any compromise even now. Just near the over the high tech elements in instruments, you can find the US like the cheap kind of policy toward China. All these kind to split, I think, trying to de-link China-US relationship. But the China and the US trade and the other areas is still going on. So you can see the US geographically is trying to bring more powers, outsider power, particularly from Europe to East Asia, to the Indo-Pacific. I think it's more power relationship, more power competitions in Asia Pacific. This is different from the 4 years ago, or even several years ago. So you can see that the Quad, the Quad from Quad to Malabar, the military exercise is expanding from the Indian Ocean to Asia, to Pacific, to the border, to the near ocean, to the East Asia of China. So the US also trying to, there is one very obvious phenomenon. It's the US trying to make India to play a bigger or even a vital role in the counterbalancing policy toward China. And there is a very high expectation of India policy toward China. So you can see the past year, the US have a very good relationship. I don't want to mention the cases. The US, UK, and then Europe, EU, they have very hot, also include Japan, very hot relationship with India. This is because India is one of the big power in this region, and which particularly India will have a border dispute with China. So this is the offshore balancing or counterbalancing strategy. Has been very, I think, shifting China relationship with USA, with Europe, with India in the past year, and have a very negative, very bad negative, negative effects on the Chinese, even the Chinese environment, foreign environments situation, but also the whole East Asia, the whole Asia Pacific. However, we can see kind of changes slightly. Recently, is the G20 summit meeting in Bali Islands of Indonesia. You can see now India, the foreign minister of Australia now is visiting Beijing now, and early last month, the German chancellor also visited Beijing, and early this month, the Europe Council President Michel visited China. And U.S. and the French President Macron will be visiting China in next few months maybe. So there are some changes, even when we see so much of this turbulence in East Asia, in the Asia Pacific in the past year. I think that both sides, if we call it China and the West, we use that kind of war narratives. If we use the war, because the China and the West, I think including other powers, they have to find a chance to calm down, to think about how we shape the future of this region. Particularly, also we can find another player is the ASEAN countries, the ASEAN community. So this is the kind of changes when we find these unchanges. So I think it is much more situation we have to see, particularly to expect maybe happening next year. One of the main difficulties is the Taiwan problem. I think that the host gave me a topic to talk about the strategic stability in Asia Pacific, the risk of escalation. I think the main risk I think is the Taiwan problem, because the sovereignty issue and the territory integrity in China. I think many countries, developing countries like India, like Pakistan, many developing countries, they are put a very high priority of the sovereignty. I think many agree with me. And no matter how the Americans or the Western Europeans, they use any kind of narrative over Taiwan problem. They said there's a peaceful development, peaceful stability. There is a main concern, and they sell weapons to Taiwan as kind of deterrence. But it's not making any sense to Chinese, because if the West cannot support Taiwan independence, it will be the precondition of the peaceful stability or peace and stability in this region. No one wants peaceful unification more than Chinese. So from the present situation, the U.S. West side also, they oppose Chinese use of force, maybe in circumstances. But the main goal is to support Taiwan to go a kind of way, peaceful independence. That is why the U.S. never say they support the Chinese peaceful unification. They want to maintain the status quo, but mainly they want the Taiwan separatists to realize a kind of peaceful independence. So that's why they sell weapons to Taiwan, make Taiwan to become a hedgehog. That's they said the military war. Hedgehog, make Chinese PLA to pay more costs. So this is here, I think, the main focus, difficulties, main problem between China and the U.S. and also the West. If the U.S. really, the West wants a peaceful unification, peace and stability over the Taiwan island, why not support peaceful unification? Why not accept Chinese unification peacefully? I think China totally will accept it. And China will also accept the USA, the presence in East Asia and the Pacific, and it will be coexistence. This is not so difficult actually in reality to realize, but I think there's much more fires from this year. You can see in early August, the Congress, the Speaker of Pelosi visited Taiwan, and the Chinese PLA also launched the military exercises around Taiwan. I think this is kind of both sides want to show these kind of cards that play on the table, that who will want to pay the cost more. I think over next year in 2023, I don't think this question will disappear or will be stabilized. I think because the U.S. still now announces several kind of packages of making of weapons sales to Taiwan, and there are more even Western countries like from the USA, from UK, the congressmen, there's kind of even officials. want to visit Taiwan. This is, I think, China cannot accept it. So this issue will be mainly, I think, if we look at the whole East Asia or Asia Pacific, you have to focus. I think this is correct. You have to focus on Taiwan. But there are also, of course, over problems like the Korean Peninsula, the Diaoyu Islands, South China Sea. There are a lot of problems over in this region. But this is all connected with China and the USA. This is a reality. So I think also Chinese know that, and Chinese know this strategic pressure from the West more and more. But it's kind of I think natural. I'm not surprised to see this. Even nuclear deterrence. China also cannot agree with that with a small package of nuclear weapons. I think this is also will negative Chinese military nuclear deterrence. So how the US and China react and react to each other. So I think in next year we'll see more of that. One more I would like to, in the last 12 minutes, I want to talk about China, India. As I said, India can be, many say that it's used by the USA to play a counterbalancing role against China. This kind of, in some cases, is correct. But I don't think the Indian government, the Modi government, don't know that. So they want to play the both kind of balancing policy between China and India, between China and the USA. The problem is when the US want to press China more, the India may think this is an opportunity for them to get more from China. So, at the bottom line, I don't think that India wants to break the relationship, diplomatic relation with China, because the US, India know the Americans want more from India, but they cannot give more to India. This is the reality. From the trades, from the investment, the FDI, even to the supply chains, the USA cannot, the USA and the West cannot so quickly or even heavily to help India to get this so-called the economic development. The best way is how to press China to make this foreign companies to leave China to India. So this is kind of a shift. I think the Indian government knows that, and India's the pragmatism of Indian policy toward China is very clear. So the risks of escalation also happens in South Asia. If we narrow the scope of this strategic competition in Asia Pacific, the USA is trying to, I think, to make the India and Pakistan as both sides that makes this more involvement. I think the main goal to involve more outsiders to involve in the great power relationship. So you can see clearly now the Russia, EU, Germany, France, UK, they're the foreign ministry, they are diplomats or even the leaders visit India. So you have more and more outsiders involved in this region. I think the India feel there can be leverage, their leverages will be higher and to be very high international position in the international affairs. So there are also Indian foreign ministry, kind of vision is changing, is transforming, is from South Asia mentality to the global mentality, that to be more assertive. That is, I think, why China and India, you can see this just a week ago, the border disputes, the border conflicts, they can be handled well, because both sides know that, particularly the US, the Indian government know this is just a kind of a card they can play with China. But the problem is the USA trying to now stand with the US, with India, with New Delhi, that they are support India's sovereignty, not China's, not they can stand in the middle. So I think this the kind of changing is part of the whole Asia Pacific risks. I'm not really sure that how China and India border this can be a spark that should make these regions unstable. But I think both sides, I think in this region particularly, I think we can see still maintain the status quo. I think is doing up. I think I have to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your different dynamics of strategic stability in Asia Pacific region with us. Ladies and gentlemen, our third speaker today is Ambassador Zamir Akram, who is currently advisor to the Strategic Plans Division. As Pakistan's ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva from 2008 till 2015, he dealt with issues such as disarmament, human rights, refugees, humanitarian affairs, trade and development, intellectual property, labor and health, among others. Ambassador Akram holds a master's degree in international relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science. He served as the honorary dean of the Geneva School of Diplomacy during 2010, where he was awarded an honorary doctorate. Ambassador today will be sharing his view on implications of great power competition, policy options for Pakistan. Sir, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do I need a microphone or?
No, you are audible.
Thank you so much. I would like to begin by thanking SVI and Brigadier Naeem Saleh for inviting me to participate in this very important debate, at a very important forum, and sharing this forum with such illustrious persons as the previous two speakers. I just want to clarify before I begin that the views that I express are my personal views and not necessarily. To talk about the implications of great power competition and what are the policy options for Pakistan, let me first briefly talk about how I see this great power competition. This is not some kind of a temporary transformation in the relations between the major powers. I see this as a systemic change, a Teutonic or change, a paradigm shift, if you will, which is going to last for the foreseeable future. And this situation has come about as a result of the United States seeking to preserve the post-Cold War global domination that it has managed to exercise since the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And the commitment to this policy has been there from virtually the first Bush administration, the elder Bush administration, to the present time, and is very clearly articulated in the national security strategy of the Biden administration that was released a couple of months ago. So this strategy clearly defines the US strategic objectives of outcompeting both Russia, which is seen as the more immediate threat because of the war in Ukraine and its policies in Europe and at least, but the greater threat is seen to be emerging from China, which is described as having both the intention and the capability of replacing the United States as the global dominant power or the region hegemon. Now, of course, the Chinese at various times have rejected or denied this objective. In fact, one of their spokesmen even went to the extent of saying that the Chinese are not that stupid to try and dominate the world. But at the same time, the Chinese have made it very clear that this is the time of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So definitely, China is not a rising power, but a superpower in its own right at this time. Similarly, the Russians under President Putin, who has overseen the resurgence of Russia, has also made it very clear that the United States and the West have to recognize Russia as a equal power in the world. And I think that one of the key reasons for the Russian invasion of Ukraine is to underscore that very point, to demonstrate that Russia will not tolerate the expansion of NATO, which in the Russian perspective undermines Russian security. So the US, while the US wants to preserve a unipolar US-dominated world, the Russians and the Chinese are seeking a transition, or argue that the world has already transited to a multipolar world instead of a unipolar world. So that's the kind of problem, that's the kind of shift or change that has taken place in the world today. Now, obviously, the US has reacted to ensure its global domination by enhancing its existing strategic alliances, both in Europe, such as through NATO and to contain Russia, and in the Asia-Pacific region by strengthening their existing alliances with countries like Japan, Australia, and setting up new strategic partnerships with countries like India. The consequence has been, of course, ever since the sort of pivot to Asia by the Obama administration, the emergence of the Quadrilateral Alliance, which you all know involves the US, Japan, Australia, and India, and more recently, the AUKUS alliance between the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom, as well as the encouragement for NATO allies to become more active within not just the European theater, but also in the Asia-Pacific theater, which is something that comes out very clearly in the Biden administration's 2022 national security strategy. Now, for Pakistan, of course, the impact of these global developments is obviously in its own region. And here, due to the paucity of time, we can't go into each and every aspect, but I just want to focus on two key aspects of the impact of this change. One is with regard to India, as well as the second, which is with regard to Afghanistan. So with India, of course, after the end of the Cold War and the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the US from that very time has been very keen on developing its relations with India, and this has been reciprocated by the Indian side, especially after the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the loss of the anchor that had really in which India's strategic policy had been established. And so the Indo-US relationship has moved very quickly. In the early 2000s, India and the United States signed a civilian nuclear cooperation agreement, which was the key to a new partnership between these two countries. This was accompanied by increasing defense partnerships, increasing military exercises, transfer of military equipment, technologies, and also the effort that is rooted in what are known as the 4 foundational agreements involving defense cooperation, intelligence sharing, technology transfer, and other aspects of cooperation between these two countries. As a result, the US has now started describing India as a major military partner or major security partner or a net security provider in the broader Asia-Pacific region, from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And in turn, this has helped the Indians, of course, not just from the United States, but also from France, from Israel, and it must be recognized also from Russia, to develop its own conventional and strategic capabilities, which have a far-reaching impact on strategic stability in South Asia, which is the overall theme of this seminar. So, how has that been possible? I think the Civilian Nuclear Cooperation Agreement and the follow-up waiver that was granted to India for NSG trade with NSG countries has enhanced India's ability to increase its nuclear weapons arsenal. If not by diverting imported fissile material, then at least by using its own indigenous sources of fissile material for increased production of nuclear weapons. India is believed credibly to be developing a hydrogen bomb. And if recent writings by persons like Ashley Tellis are to be believed, then India is also likely to conduct additional nuclear tests of a hydrogen bomb, because the last so-called hydrogen bomb test was a fizzle. And so they will need to test again. In addition, of course, we all know that India has a triad of delivery systems, air, land, and sea-based missiles, both from short, medium to long-range missiles, including most recently an ICBM or ICBMs in the Agni series. India has also developed a credible ballistic missile defense system with the S-400, with the Patriot missile and the Arrow missiles, which has a combination of three different kinds of anti-missile or anti-ballistic missile capabilities. In 2019, India tested this anti-satellite weapon, the ASAT test, and it has been involved in developing the supersonic and even a hypersonic version of the BrahMos missile in collaboration with the Russians. In terms of the impact on Indian nuclear policy and strategy, we have seen the result of the cooperation between the strategic partner, the Indo-US Strategic Partnership, leading first in 2004 to the elaboration of the Cold Start Doctrine, which is to be able to fight a limited conventional war below the nuclear threshold. And then when Pakistan has responded to that by the development of its full spectrum deterrence approach to counter, to ensure deterrence at the operational, technical, and strategic levels, we now are increasingly hearing talk about the Indians being considering or developing the ability for a preemptive first strike. That is also something where considerable academic work has been done, and to my mind at least, this can be a credible possibility, but it is highly dangerous because it can lead India into a false sense of concern that it will have an impact, a false sense of security, which can lead to nuclear confrontation. Now, on the other side, of course, what are we going to do about this? I think the most important thing, and that's where the positive aspects are, I think it's very clear to me that in terms of our choices, in terms of our strategic choices, it's very clear that our strategic choice remains in developing, enhancing our existing strategic relationship with the Chinese. And I don't see the relationship with the US evolving into any kind of strategic partnership, because there isn't a strategic anchor between the two countries. The China-Pakistan strategic partnership can also highlight India's own vulnerability on two fronts. And by that I mean India's vulnerability in occupied Kashmir with China on the Ladakh border, as we are seeing the confrontation that is continuing, and on the LOC with Pakistan at the same time. We can jointly build up linkages with China and Russia through Afghanistan, linking with Central Asia. That again is a strategic possibility, but of course that will depend on ensuring greater stability in Afghanistan, which does not seem to be possible. But certainly there is a convergence. There is a convergence between Pakistan, China, and Russia on that account. So to conclude, I think the possibilities exist for Pakistan to improve and enhance its strategic partnership with China. And this has been made possible because of this great power competition to a very large extent. And so while there are challenges, there are also opportunities for Pakistan to exploit in the years to come. Thank you. I will end over.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Now I'm opening the session for question and answer sessions and discussions. First, I would like to request our discussants to please share your views if you have any questions, but please be brief and summarize your views in 2 minutes. Then I will open the session for question and answer session for the virtual participants. For the virtual participants, if you have any question, please use the Q&A option to type your questions. Thank you. So if anyone has any point or question to make, please.
Thank you so much, and my apologies that I could join this thing towards the very end. Though I'm not so certain that what was being discussed before my appearance over here, but there's one question which I just want to ask. And since Master Zamil is very much around, and the topic itself is about this great power competition. My question is that for a very long time, Pakistan worked very closely with the Americans in the interest of regional and international peace and stability. What we have seen for last around 10 years, that US role, which happened to be a balancer in the region, US was very much concerned in the region, for the sake of, like, it was having this very constructive role in the region. It has turned to be more like a side taking with India. So what Pakistan can do to rope US again back, so that US can keep on playing that constructive and positive role for the sake of regional peace and stability?
But I would really question whether the US actually played a constructive role or not. I mean, in my view, I think the US-Pakistan relationship has, from both sides, been a very transactional relationship. And we've had close relations when it suited the two countries, and we have had not so close relations when those conditions have not existed. And I think that ever since the end of the Cold War, the US has moved and has made its own strategic choices. That's the important thing, that from the American strategic perspective, the more important partner for them is India. And that is not because they have anything, they are against Pakistan, but because India is a useful partner against China. That is the real reason. So whenever the Americans have interceded, for instance, they have done so out of the concern, particularly since 1986-87, when the brass tacks exercises took place. That happened during the background of both countries having virtually acquired nuclear weapons. And so the US interest since that time has been to prevent an escalation between India and Pakistan to a nuclear war. And that's really the reason. But when, for instance, in Kargil or even in 2019, that was the reason why the US interceded to ensure that the two countries did not go, the war, that the clashes did not escalate. However, the US has done nothing and perhaps cannot do anything to actually address the underlying problem between India and Pakistan. And that is the issue, the disputes that you know very well, Kashmir and all those things. Apart from basically saying that it is up to the two countries to find solutions. What is more dangerous, and my last point is that what is more dangerous is that in 2019, after the attack in Pulwama, the then National Security Advisor virtually gave a green signal to the Indians to launch an attack against Pakistan. And I know that at that time, when we were trying to get in touch with the Pentagon and the White House and the State Department to try and prevent an escalation from the Indian side, our calls remained unanswered. And it was only after we had carried out the attack, carried out the operation, and shot down an Indian aircraft, that the Americans stepped in to end the confrontation. So that is my experience of this.
Sir, please,
Thank you. Thank you, Sir Salik, for arranging this. A point was made regarding entanglement and how it could play out between the US and China and even Russia. I think this issue of entanglement is more pronounced in the South Asian case. We see, we have this example of BrahMos incident from this March. Indian side claims, some of their scholars, they claim that this is a conventional missile. But on the other hand, there is a lot of literature to suggest that this is in fact a nuclear capable missile system. And same is the case with other missile systems like Prahar and Prale. So this ambiguity between two nuclear armed states, I don't know how it is going to play out in times of crisis. So this is an aspect that needs to be looked into more detail. And on this issue of new norms over anti-satellite weapon systems, I think at least 4 states have already demonstrated this capability. Once the norms are formulated at this point in time, these norms are more likely going to apply to states which have not demonstrated this capability. So it would be like an NPT 2.0 dealing with space weapons where there will be certain haves and certain have-nots. And on this issue of China producing new fissile material, I think there needs to be a clarification on this. As far as I know, or as far as I have read, they are known to be using their existing stocks and are not developing or producing new fissile material. Okay. And on this issue of NPT being a success story, I think this is the version that the P5 would like to present. Once we look at how issues of nuclear disarmament and peaceful nuclear cooperation have been dealt with, I don't think it would be seen as a success story by the majority of non-nuclear weapon states who are party to the NPT. And lastly, on this issue of Western support for India vis-a-vis China, I think as the tensions between India and China increase, India is likely to gain greater access to new technology and military hardware, which, as we have seen in the past, is more likely to be used against Pakistan than China. So I think this is going to further increase problems for Pakistan rather than China. So these were a few points that I'd like the panelists to comment on.
We can go at the end.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you, Dr. Naeem Salik, for providing this opportunity to listen to these experts. And second thing, I would like to compliment all the speakers for giving us a very comprehensive and detailed perspective on global strategic issues and how things are going to shape the future of this global strategic environment. It has been rightly pointed out by William that there's a proliferation of fears of proliferation. But I believe there are fears of proliferation of new technology to friendly states, not to the rest of the world, but new technology proliferation to the friendly states, like the US is providing technology, latest technology, and signing different agreements as earlier highlighted by Amir Akram, and making India a strong, you can say, I should not use this word, but making it India as a bully in this region to achieve its objectives. So on this note, there's a question for William that since you have highlighted that there's a fears of proliferation and international security is going to be an unstable one, then the international community should look at the ways to stabilize this security environment. When we look at the South Asian example, then comes when we look at Pakistan is more interested towards developing those technologies which can ensure strategic stability at a regional level. But at a global level, these major powers are going to develop those technologies which are going to destabilize that global strategic stability. Global strategic stability was there in Cold War time, but now it's been eroded. So do you think that there's a need to establish that global strategic stability to control these fears and to control the fears of escalation, as our Chinese expert have highlighted? And there is another question that was highlighted by our ambassador Samir Akram and William, that China is unconstrained. I mean, there is no such restriction or limit on any country to develop itself against its threat perceptions. When we look at the American build-up or American spending on the military technologies and latest equipment, there's a huge gap between China and India. So in that context, it's not possible for China to suddenly meet that gap and come at par with the US and Russia and other parts. But again, there are threat perception, there are geopolitical concerns. On those concerns, we can say that there's a competition going on between these parts. But again, there's no such limits or no such restrictions. Maybe another way so that is to make part China of these international instruments and these treaties and norms, then these states have to come down to that level. So these are my observations regarding this subject. So maybe panelists can answer this.
Answer.
My short comment, and I think a question from William and my friend Yotong. So I think you very rightly highlighted the ongoing conflict at the international level and the arms race which is going on, and it's a very gloomy picture that we don't see anything, any stability or peace coming. There's a conflict which is coming. So I think you are absolutely right that there's a requirement of arms control, where realization of an arms control between the great powers, and then subsequently it should trickle down to the regional level, including China, India, and India, Pakistan. Of course, it is there. But my question to you is that what are the probabilities of peaceful rise? For example, isn't this world too large enough and too great enough for the US, China, and other contenders of the power to grow and to develop collectively together? So is it this the problem of the paradigm, the realist paradigm which we follow, that it is a zero-sum game, that the gain of something is at basically the loss of the other, or the security of one is the insecurity of the other? So can we blame the scholars and those who are the academicians to create that argument of that perpetual ongoing conflict? So I hope that you will be able to help us and put the blame onto the scholars also, along with the politicians. And then my friend Yutong, I think very comprehensive overview of Chinese understanding of what is going on and the perspective from China. Most of us are mostly aware of the American perspective of on the international perspective. So I think on the international politics. So we are pleased that you have added up how the Chinese think about the conflict going on. You talked about the American policy of involving the outsiders into the conflict, into the China American competition. And I think I agree with you that the more outsiders the Americans, because of their own history of building alliances and not coming straight one-to-one. So that is very dangerous. And of course, as Ambassador Zamir also highlighted, that the outfall or the fallout of this Indo-US partnership is growing and is creating security threats for Pakistan. So why the Americans should not involve the others? Why the Chinese single-handedly want to only counter America single-handedly, and you don't want the allies should join the Americans? So this is my simple question to you. So thank you very much.
I think I would like to request both Professor Vuitton and William Elberg here to answer first the questions, and then I will pose the questions from Q&A boxes to you.
Thank you, Salman.
Sorry.
You want me to start? I can start. Okay. So yeah, a lot of questions about China's peaceful rise, China's nuclear material, and a lack of constraint. So you know that the US and Russia, France and the UK have all declared that they will no longer make weapons usable fissile material. The US and Russia both have warhead caps. France has self-constrained its warhead total, and the UK recently raised its ceiling, but still has a very low total. China has absolutely no limit on its plutonium or HU production, and they are now building a very large civil plutonium fuel cycle, which will, because of their civil military fusion concept, allow them, whenever they choose, to build up on warheads massively very, very quickly. Estimates by Frank von Hippel and Henry Sokolsky say that they could be 100 warheads very, very soon, within a couple of years. It would be nice if they were to say that they'd abjure the production of plutonium or highly enriched uranium. That would be a good thing, but they don't. Why not? Because they want to build up. I understand. But the idea that China wants the US and Russia to build down so that China doesn't have to build up, I think that's long gone. If you look at the number of missile silos they've built, if you look at their ICBM production rates, if you look at their SLBM production rates and their heavy bomber production rates, President Xi has said it directly. He wants to be a world-class nuclear power by, 2030? He keeps moving that date earlier, and I get it. But a lot of the questions are predicated on China from the 1990s or 2000s. That's not the case anymore. The China of 2022 wants to be, I think, equal with the US and Russia, not by the US and Russia building down, but by China building up. On the outer space race, I mean, it's happening. I think the US has decided that it's not worth it, and they want out of this space race. China and Russia's treaty, which again comes from this 90s and 2000s vision of the world and not even what they're doing, makes it very, very difficult. But I do agree that things that the US, so this is the hub and spoke relationship, things that the Russians do to deter the US, then make the Chinese worried when the US tries to defend themselves, which then makes India worried to defend themselves against China, which means that Pakistan has to react. Unfortunately, neither China nor Russia are really interested in arms control. Russia has said they are going to use arms control agreements in order to induce fear in the West. They use risk. They use everything that they can in diplomacy to try to get the West to do what it wants. And this Russian revisionism makes things very difficult. As you know, in this region, revisionism and ethno-nationalism can be very difficult to deal with. And China's wolf diplomacy, I mean, I think Russia and China both see everything in very zero-sum terms. I think the US and many other countries are willing to see things in non-zero-sum terms. But it becomes really difficult. You know, and when you talk about the US proliferating technology to friendly states, sure. And Russia has proliferated to Iran and Saudi Arabia. China has proliferated to Saudi Arabia. Russia has proliferated. In fact, South Korea's biggest advances in missiles came from the purchase in the 1990s of Russian missile technology under the Brown Bear program. And I think nowadays, when the US looks at China, it realizes that it cannot equal China alone. If China chooses to build up a global dominating force, that it's going to need, that the United States is going to need all the friends it can get. And I think China just can't help itself in making enemies. I'm glad to see that Pakistan and China have a good relationship. I think that makes sense for Pakistan. But when you look at the countries, you know, in East Asia and Southeast Asia, they all have a very different view of China's rise. They see Chinese threats as being very real. They see what's happening in the South China Sea as being incredibly destabilizing. China is doing all kinds of things to threaten the security of Japan and South Korea. So, you know, again, I'm glad to see Pakistan can develop a good relationship with China, but China has very few friends because it can't help itself from making enemies. It continues to, you know, take territory that the international community does not recognize in the South China Sea, and to threaten stability. And so I think China is in this period of growth, and it doesn't quite know where its limits are going to be. And the sooner China gets out of the zero-sum game and starts talking about arms control with the US and with Russia, I think the sooner they start to see limits as a good thing, the better. Does that mean that they have to have 1,500 strategic nuclear weapons? I don't know. I hope not, but I think that they are racing up to that level. So we'll see. We're in a difficult period, as I said, and at least this US administration wants to negotiate. They want arms control. They're willing to put constraint out there and self-restraint as a way forward. But you know, China sees no interest in restraint and is not acting accordingly. And Russia obviously is unconstrained in what it's doing in really terrible ways in many different regions. So I hope that's answered all the questions before me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I think particularly my friend Nasir, for your question. It's a wonderful question. First, I would like to talk about the peaceful rise. Just one several sentences. Peaceful rise. China has been peaceful rising for more than 40 years. So this is the reality. This is not just the beginning of peaceful rise or peaceful development. So the problem is how other countries follow China to be the peaceful rise, to have the peaceful rise or peaceful development. This is the problem. But in international relations, this can be a chicken and egg question. So I cannot really answer that China wants continue the peaceful rise and other also to follow China to have military or even less and less accept Chinese growth. This particularly the Western countries. I don't think is can be a trend. So I like to say that. Regarding to China-US relations, and particularly over Taiwan, over other issues, we can find very, interestingly, the US is doing the Cold War means. That there is more alliance around China. As I mentioned, the Quad, the OSCO, and also supporting India to counterbalancing China. And also you can see the US want to press to the ASEAN countries to choose between China and the USA. So this is a kind of Cold War mentality or Cold War means. That is, you can see the US is doing the same, had been done the same to Soviet Union. However, there you can find other changes around. This is why the US can doesn't admit this is the Cold War or new Cold War against China, because there are some differences. As National mentions, just one by one or one to one, US want to make a conflict with China, the US cannot do that. The US wants more alliance. The problem is there are not all the Western countries around China supporting US this kind of means militarily. You can find after the Pelosi visit to Taiwan, Chinese military also exercises around China, around Taiwan, and makes this whole region fear that China and the US military conflict may be inevitable. So they worry about that. From the beginning, I think this is the one case the ASEAN countries, the Philippines, the ASEAN countries, including the other like Japan, South Korea, also they worry about how the US, they cannot do so aggressively against China's military strongs over Taiwan Island, particularly. The ASEAN countries privately criticize the US governments to do too much more stronger against China, make China maybe angry, that maybe makes this kind of escalation of military conflict between the two great powers. So the ASEAN countries ask the ASEAN Washington to not cross the red line over Taiwan Islands. If when you say you want a peaceful rise, peaceful development, peaceful step and stability around Taiwan Islands, but you have to do something. So you can see in these several months, the US military, the ships, the jets also basically could come to this region, it's narrowing, it's more less and less. I think the US is doing the right way to accept the ASEAN countries, particularly, I think including India. India also don't want really to join this China-US military, I think, conflicts. But maybe Japan won't. So the ASEAN countries, on the security side, they want US military presence in East Asia to balance Chinese military strength. On the other hand, in the economic fields, in the trade relationships, the ASEAN countries do not want the China-US military escalation harm or endanger this economic development in this region. I think this is both sides, I think, restrictions against China, but also against the USA. So we cannot neglect the ASEAN countries trying the best to choose the middle way, to choose the medium way to act between China and the USA. This is quite, I think, hopeful that for this region,
I think there is an
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. This is internet disconnection. I'm sorry. I just finished. Okay. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Please, sure. Go ahead.
Thank you. I finished.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I finished. I finished it. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I think now I would like to request Dr. Salma, please, if you want to share your opinions with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chair, for the invitation as well as the opportunity to be one of the discussants. Two things that I would actually, because a lot has been discussed already, so I don't want to get into an overkill. But from Pakistan's side, I would actually say that as how the situation is unfolding, and the point that Ambassador Zamir has also pointed out about stability of Afghanistan. So going in reverse, I would actually say that for Pakistan, we need to see how this entire situation is going to be beneficial for us. Where we say that with transition, there's a lot of ambiguity or the grayness that comes, we are pretty sure that there are a minimum of 2 power centers that are coming up. Or in case there are no power center, not 2, but 3 power centers. But the US would ideally like to maintain its position where it is, starting from Bush Senior to the Biden administration. The direction is very clear. Pakistan tried during the Cold War its best to side with the US, given its security priorities. But at the moment, the security in that purely traditional Cold War sense is also undergone a transformation. We are not only looking at traditional security parameters, we're also looking at non-traditional security parameters, in which economics is the most overriding concern. So if I were to look at it from the Pakistani side, for me, the first order of the priority would be bring my house in order. And for all the Western audience, which may think that, okay, China may not have too many friends, but then also see that when the powers are rising, friendships rise with the rising powers. And for Pakistan, what is China offering? An economic stability, an economic bailout package. Why shouldn't we take it? Because for the moment, it is pretty generous. It's for us to make how generous or how well we benefit from that system. So it's a two-way traffic. And the same could be said about Pakistan-US relations during the Cold War. So if we call it transactional today, as in a wisdom of hindsight, then we also need to see how these new terms of references are evolving. And the main point that China and Russia do not have any bars over any of the policies that are in place. When you put too much of restrictions on rising powers, this is what happens. China has the potential to create an alternative, and it is doing that. And that is the rise and fall of the great powers. We would not like to have a fall of a great power because most of the bulk of the ugliness of that fall would fall on the global south, erstwhile global south. And Pakistan would ideally like its friends to remain stable and steady because the instability would directly. So that factor is there. However, you need to see that if you become very selective in having, as what Qasim had said, friends or allies, and you try to bring up one ally because you're trying to make a power balancer in the region, then this China-India-US connection is creating a lot of problems for Pakistan, which has a host of its own issues to deal with, of which this very factor that we empower India to such a point Pakistan becomes strategically irrelevant, and neither does its needs remain too strong to defend Pakistan, nor does Kashmir remain relevant. So it could not be the case. Pakistan would retaliate. Pakistan would respond, and it would like to secure itself more. So I think it's part of this entire stability paradox or stability relation, where you do remain cognizant and empathetic to other ex-allies' concerns as well as to where it is going to take this entire situation. This new statement by the US administration that they would like to help us resolve terrorism, on the face value, it looks wonderful. But do you really mean how this terrorism is going to be resolved, which is evolving out of Afghanistan? And Afghanistan, with the US after a very flawed investment of 20 years suddenly ditched and ran away, has created the entire bulk of problem for Pakistan. So the selective interpretation, the selective engagement, selective relation is not going to help US remain as a global power for too long. There are global alternatives which are coming up, and countries which are compelled by their needs are going to take up those offers. So to have a more balanced world system, the international community needs to be aware of this. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Salma. Ladies and gentlemen, I know that you all have many questions, and I can see that question and answer box is full with 28 questions as have already. But due to the time constraints and because we are already overshooting time, I'm going to request the speakers of the second session to start. So I will be taking your questions at the end of it. Ladies and gentlemen, second session today is crisis escalation, nuclear deterrence, and doctrinal shift in South Asia. First speaker today that will be joining us today is Dr. Ali Ahmed. Dr. Ali Ahmed is a freelance strategic analyst. He has been a UN official, academic, and infantry officer. He is also an author of India's Doctrinal Puzzle, Limiting War in South Asia, published by Routledge in 2014. So Dr. Ali Ahmed, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. I must apologize because I would be using PowerPoint. And let me just see if I can share my screen with you all. Would this be visible, please?
Yes, this is visible.
Good, then we are ready to go. Thank you very much, firstly, to Strategic Vision Institute for having me over. I see that there are two parts to your conference. The first is about crisis escalation and the second about deterrence. So stability is where I will be pitching at, because I've been invited to speak at crisis escalation and drivers of instability. Moving on, without further ado, let me say that crisis is not pre-violence alone. It would also play out during conflict while violence is ongoing. And therefore, I will be pitching not so much at the nuclear aspect of crisis, but also at the crises that occur in other non-violent or pre-violence phases too. My second point is the drivers of stability that we have been invited to speak on. That's a very sensible thing to do so that they can be meted against. But we must also remember that there are drivers of stability too, and they need to then be reinforced. And we need to also factor in those in when we really take into account the holistic picture. And finally, I will be casting, as I said, my net rather wide to include crises across the board. How I shall be proceeding to do that is to look at levels of war and levels of analysis. I would be searching for drivers at the levels of analysis, and I will then join the two together to see what kind of a cycle then develops. Is it a negative or a positive cycle, a virtuous cycle, or a regressive cycle? There's a little bit of subjectivity in all this, but I hope you will indulge me there. The levels of war, without belaboring the slides, you're well aware: subconventional, conventional, nuclear, and the two fire breaks between the three levels. The levels of analysis, again, you're very familiar with this: international, national, and subnational. But I've added a little bit of nuance. There's the regional, the interstate dimension, which would be essentially India, Pakistan in our case, because we are restricted to South Asia. Otherwise, if we are talking of Southern Asia, then that would be the regional. National, I would look mostly at India, and I speak for myself. And then there is organizational, that's the national security apparatus, and the personalities that are part of the national security apparatus, both at the political level, the organizational level. And the complexity would then be how it depends on which level that crisis has pitched at, whether it's in one of those levels to the left of the screen. And as you can see on the right, those are the levels of analysis at which would be informing that crisis, which would be influencing that crisis, which will be playing out. So that's the sui generis thing. It's ongoing. It's all the time. And now when a crisis outbreak takes place, whether it's a subconventional, conventional, etc., those would continue whirring in the background, creating their own influences, and that would then impact how the crisis outcome comes about. So this, we would be having
Mr. Ahmed, sorry for interrupting you, but we cannot see your video. Is that intentional that you haven't turned on your camera?
Okay,
Oh.
right. So but do you see my slides?
Yes, we can see your slides.
Oh, good. Then we can continue because those are more important than seeing my mugshot. And as you can see, that bearded gentleman seems to be an imposter as far as I can see. Now, how do I proceed down this with that thing on? Yeah. So crisis, as I told you, is it's across the board that we will be taking on. Rather too much for 15 minutes, but then let's see if I succeed in compressing it all together. And here are some examples which we are all familiar with, which might have found mention in the first session. Now we go and look for those drivers at the various levels of analysis. So at the international level, that is the upper level, which I thought I heard was the crux of the first session. We've got Ukraine war precedents. As you see, it has unhinged many of the verities of international relations. We know there's a hegemonic war on, in fact, in a hybrid form, more or less, between Sino and the US. And of course, there is also, as I told you, it's not all drivers of instability, but also drivers of stability. In our case, if we are to talk of international level, they would be worried about what we do to each other in South Asia, especially in the Indo-Pak context, because both being nuclear powers. Therefore, international concern would be understandably higher, and therefore that might be a driver of stability as such. Regional, we've got China with hegemonic ambitions. It wants to box India into the South Asian sandbox. It, as per Indians, using Pakistan to do so. And then there are all three states having these two-front threats. Even China has got a two-front threat. It's got a Pacific front to bother about. India and Pakistan too have a two-front threats, and how that plays out, we will have to see as part of the crisis. And finally, there is the threat of extremism. It kind of expands into conflict zones, and you could expect to see it welcoming conflict in this area too. And therefore, we need to be wary about that. Interstate, that's India, Pakistan. We've got Kashmir as a bone of contention. No need to belabor that. But the good part is that apparently there's been just 2 incidents of breach of the ongoing ceasefire along the line of control, which is a positive. But then the political dynamics are such. There are 3 elections coming up. There's a Kashmir election. There's a national election in India 2024. There's an election in Pakistan next year. And those political dynamics we will have to see. But again, the good part is that the militaries are now more balanced. I think the Pakistani military must be quite relieved that the second front has kind of opened up on the other side of India, and India has apparently moved some strike formations, etc., away from the Western Front. And there presumably there is a certain military balance then that then doesn't force Pakistan to up the escalatory ladder and go off to the nuclear plane and draw the full spectrum deterrence down around it. It could well take on India on the conventional plane. So these are the things that, although we would expect to see it as a driver of instability, but then there are certain, nice elements that seem to be there that contribute to stability more than instability. So instability is not as pronounced as perhaps we would like to build it to. National, in India, we've got this philosophy that's subscribed to not only by the government, but by a proportion of our people, and that's Hindutva. Hindutva, in a negative way, you could see it as majoritarianism, but it could also be a sense of revivalism of the majority community. And that then sets the pace, including, it's got a kind of paradigm dominant status within India for the moment. The opposition is not visible. Of course, there are the economic and social planes that then the political plane has to reckon with. On the economic front, it's not all bad in the sense that how that turns out to be a driver would depend on what kind of economic, if it's a downturn, then we would expect to see the government trying to divert attention into perhaps a crisis or a conflict. And otherwise, if it's an economic upswing, the government might like to preserve it that way. So in a way, we would have to see how things play out when a crisis outbreak takes place, how a particular driver then appears. Similarly, social polarization, how Hindutva might like to take advantage of that, or to try and tamp down on it also. In a sense, it wouldn't want to get off a tiger it is riding and have the tiger eat it up. So, and Hindutva has the moral and intellectual resources to be able to control that social polarization. If there's this nationalism, how it can be grappled with to the ground. So it's not all bleak is the point I want to convey actually. Organizational, Indian Armed Forces, you've got the doctrines, they're seemingly offensive, as a regional power, self-assured regional power, it has got a certain aggressiveness in its doctrines. Then there is the issue of politicization of late. Politicization by way of which I mean, telling the political level what it wishes to hear and not what it needs to hear. And then there is restructuring. There are 3 levels of restructuring. You've heard of Agniveer. at the operational level, you've got them going into integrated battle groups, and at the higher level, you've got them looking for jointness and integrated theater commands. But all in all, you've got political compliance. So whatever it is, the organizational level will be responsive to the political level, which is essentially what happens at the national level, which is how will play out at the organizational level. And finally, there is the issue of personalities. We've got very significant personalities in place. We've got a prime minister, we've got a national security advisor, and we've got a chief of defense staff these days. So these are personalities whose interlinkages and will determine how the national and the organizational levels play out. We in South Asia could also look closer and see. Of course, whatever I say with respect to India will have a mirroring aspect towards Pakistan. For instance, if there was a General Bajwa, there is a doctrine, Bajwa doctrine, seemingly benign, that is associated with him. So likewise, you could expect that the personalities too bring with them their own baggage in India. So given that we've identified these drivers within these levels of analysis, now let's look at how they might affect when they play out at a crisis at different levels of war. We've got the drivers at the international level on the one hand, and we've got the crisis unfolding at the various levels of a crisis. These would be, suppose it's a sub-conventional crisis, how do we expect the international level to influence that? So my overall reading seems to be that at the lower levels of the levels of war, sub-conventional, really there would be very little efficacy at the international level to influence what happens between us, India and Pakistan. It's essentially what we need to, as we go up that ladder, that's where the international concerns will be heightened, they will be more efficacious. So that's a good thing, that the drivers of instability or stability would kick in. The higher we go, that's when we need them, essentially. Regional level, again, my finding seems to be that we would be left to ourselves. I think there is an exhaustion with India-Pakistan issues. There's exhaustion with these periodic crises we have. And we've been relying on the US and perhaps even China sometimes to pluck our chestnuts out of the fire. But this time around, I think we might be left alone after we've seen the Ukraine war play out. We might even be left alone to fight it out conventionally, It's only when we start nudging the nuclear threshold that even regional concerns will kick in, and there would be mitigatory effects. There would be an intervention that might try and bring about conflict termination. That's a good thing once again. Interstate drivers, how they play out at the various levels of war in a crisis. I think, again, like I said, at the lower levels, I think we are pretty much on our own. So as responsible states, we must take charge and stop looking outside the region to try and help out, assist us, pull us out of the mud we've got into. But the only difference, even as we go up, the interstate dimension, when we, because it's going to be strategy, there's going to be a two-player game. You've got to mesh what Pakistan does too, and that's where we at the upper levels are not so well. It's very indeterminate. We cannot really make a claim that the cycle that might break out, would that be positive or would it be negative? And that's bad enough. If it's indeterminate, then it's bad. National level, as I told you, the way I look at it, Hindutva is here to stay. Hindutva wishes to consolidate. As of the moment, or at least through this remainder of this decade, it is unlikely to wish to be tested. And therefore, it would not like to see, whereas in the lower levels of war, it might wish to, present a muscular image. But as we go higher, it would wish to disconnect. It would like to disengage. It would like to dissipate crises. And that's a very positive thing in terms of, so what we may see is, more ruthless lower level crises, but much more measured as we go up that ladder. So that's a positive in a way. But then since we have these periodic crises, even at the lower levels, we've got to be watchful that they don't then, there is a phase, the rhetoric that we are now engaging with. It's reaching such depths that we need to be slightly more wary. Organizational level, wherever there is always a push from the organizational level to do its thing, and a war is where the national security is supposed to pitch itself. So we might expect a little bit more pushing, shoving there, but they are well aware that the nuclear level is not to be ventured into, and I think that's true for both sides. So here is something that I'd like to flag as positive too. And finally, it's about personalities here. We need, I'm sure the people who matter keep a watch on each other and how a certain person might think through a certain crisis. So, but from a strategic point of view, it needs to be included when we as strategists discuss. So overall, since we've been reminded of time, let me go back to the complexity I was talking about. I have now merged those two, as I told you, as part of my method to kind of look at how we would merge the levels of war with the levels of analysis. And this is what it seems to me. The red would be, we will have to fend for ourselves. Green is where we need to be watchful that though we fend for ourselves, let not push beyond a point. And I think blue is where I give ourselves some marks that we are very careful. We would be careful because it's speculative at the moment, and I hope I am right. Overall, I would say, yeah, as we climb up that particular, up the escalatory kind of ladder along those levels of war, you see that even if these cycles, the cycle is mostly negative, the drivers of conflict will be wearing away at various speeds. But as we go up, I think the drivers of instability might become more cautious. They may decelerate, and the drivers of stability that I was talking about may kick in. So since we have not factored those in, I am kind of sanguine that perhaps as we go up the channel, up that crisis escalatory ladder, we might be less. But that should not make us complacent. Obviously, we simply cannot head that way. And that's the conundrum. When it is hunky-dory at the lower levels, we indulge ourselves in crisis. But the problem is that's when we are shoving and shoving us, both of us, towards the upper levels. And therefore, we shouldn't really be complacent that nothing was going to happen at that level, and therefore we can fight it out at this level. So I think I will stop at that, and I leave you with a more positive frame of mind, that blue on the right corner. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ali Ahmed. Ladies and gentlemen, now we have second speaker of the second session, Dr. Mansoor Ahmed with us. Dr. Mansoor Ahmed is an independent security analyst. He was a senior fellow at the Center for International Strategic Studies, Islamabad from 2018 to 2022, and a Stanton Nuclear Security Junior Fellow from 2015 to 2016, and a postdoctoral research fellow to 2016 to 2018 at the Howard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He was a visiting scholar at the Cooperative Monitoring Center, Sandia National Laboratories in 2013 as well. Previously, Dr. Ahmed served as a lecturer in Department of Defense and Strategic Studies, Quaid-e-Azam University from 2011 to 2015, and has received a PhD in International Relations from Quaid-e-Azam University as well. His research work has been published by the Belfer Center, the Stimson Center, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. His topic for deliberation today is BMD and Emerging Technologies, Impact on Deterrence Stability. So without any further ado, I would give floor to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Salek and Asfiya, for this opportunity to speak on BMT and emerging technologies and the impact on deterrence stability in South Asia. I will not be going into a lot of detail about BMD developments in South Asia, but more about how that is impacting the overall deterrent stability vis-a-vis Pakistan and China. But very briefly, it is well known that India has been pursuing a ballistic missile defense capability as part of its integrated air defense network since at least 1999-2000. It was in the year 2006 or 7 that India tested its first Prithvi air defense missile, and which led further development of the Prithvi defense vehicle, which was whose test was conducted in 2014, but its initial success at intercepting a moving target was achieved only in 2017. And then we are all aware of the ASAT test that India conducted in March 2019 at a distance of about 283 kilometers, in which a moving target was destroyed in low Earth orbit, but this test was conducted under controlled conditions. And it was said at the time that it employed elements from India's emerging BMD architecture. And only last month, India claims to have conducted the first successful test of the 81 interceptor missile. And this flight test was carried out with participation of all BMD weapon system elements located at different geographical locations. And I think it is only yesterday that there was a photograph of a dome-shaped early warning radar published for the first time in one of the Indian national newspapers. So in some way, they are trying to follow the pattern of the US building an early warning missile, early warning system. And you're also all aware of the S-400 system being acquired from Russia. Well, the S-400 is a very potent surface-to-air missile air defense system, but it is not actually a missile defense system as it is widely believed to be so, because of the limitations of the Earth's curvature and the radar coverage, etc. But nevertheless, there have been 5 regiments that have been acquired, and all of them are likely to be, their deliveries are likely to be completed by 2023. And India is also working on directed energy weapon technologies as part of its BMD network. And I would like to point out here that as far back as 2012, the then US Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter had said that there is a lot of scope for technological collaboration between the United States and India on ballistic missile defense technologies. So it's important to understand the logic behind India pursuing this. One, of course, is technological determinism and bureaucratic politics and organizational interests, especially the DRDO. Secondly, there is this prestige factor. And third, of course, the perceived threat from China and Pakistan. That is the third major driver for this. But we should understand that this is part of the damage limitation strategy as was coined by the United States, which had initially developed BMD technologies to reduce the vulnerability to Soviet nuclear forces and submarine-based missiles during the Cold War. And this was designed to essentially achieve damage limitation in 2 ways. One was to target and destroy the enemy's strategic forces on the ground and at sea, generally known as counterforce. And the second corresponding component of this strategy was to develop the capacity to intercept enemy's missiles before they could reach the targets. And this is reflected even in the 2019 US Nuclear Posture Review, which states that in the event of a conflict, the US would seek to prevent and defeat adversary missile attacks through a combination of deterrence, active and passive missile defenses, and attack operations to destroy offensive missiles prior to launch. So damage limitation advocates in the West have argued that if deterrence fails, these capabilities would serve to minimize the escalatory advantage of an adversary. And the same thing applies in South Asia. Because India perceives a twin threat from China and Pakistan, but because missile defenses are yet to be developed and deployed, provide foolproof defense against the strategic nuclear attack, even for countries like the United States, because of their questionable success rate in different tests. For example, the success rate in US interceptor tests is not more than 50%, and that is also probably under controlled conditions. The other part of the damage limitation strategy is to pursue strategic counterforce capabilities in order to achieve a decapitating first strike, to neutralize the other adversaries' strategic nuclear forces and associated infrastructure. While that remains part of the US strategy, that is also the part of India's developing strategy, and there is considerable evidence that India is actually moving in that direction. And one of which, of course, is the development of the PMT sheet itself. Sophisticated ISR satellite early warning network for target acquisition. India already has a vast network of military satellites, and its foundational agreements with the United States will augment its situational awareness even further. Then there is the development of counterforce capabilities themselves, and this includes nuclear and conventional counterforce. And all major nuclear powers are developing strategic conventional weapons or strategic non-nuclear weapons. And India has recently said that there have been news reports that India is also raising a strategic rocket force on the pattern of the PLA rocket force, coupled with a triad of the supersonic BrahMos missiles. And there is a hypersonic version of the BrahMos that is also under development. And at least some elements of the BrahMos triad are being integrated with the Sukhoi's long-range Sukhoi aircraft under the SFC, the Strategic Forces Command, which means that they would have a dedicated nuclear role. And the BrahMos itself, the different ranges are being extended along with the Nirbhay, which is a subsonic system, which can carry a much heavier payload to ranges greater than 1,000 kilometers, but that is still under research and development phase. And in 2021, India conducted the first test of the Agni Prime ballistic missile. It is a canisterized system which can carry at least 2 MIRVs. There are other standoff weapon systems that can be used for strategic conventional counterforce. For example, there was a news item only recently that India is adding the Rampage air-to-ground missiles with a range of 250 kilometers that it is acquiring from Israel to its Sukhoi fighters. And one of the reasons why India also acquired the Rafale was the 36 Rafale aircraft was that it can launch strategic counterforce and strategic nuclear strikes using air-launched cruise missiles. Well, in addition to that, it is very clear that India is expanding its strategic nuclear arsenal and is in the process of adding to its nuclear submarine fleet, is canisterizing its missiles, and has no choice, in my opinion, but to add more warheads in order to meet the requirements of its shifting doctrine. There is a huge latent nuclear potential that I've written about earlier also, and I think over time there is greater evidence to suggest that India will tap into this huge latent fissile material potential, especially unsafeguarded plutonium. It is very interesting if you look at the stockpile estimates of the International Panel on Fissile Materials. The weapons worth stockpiles of India's unsafeguarded plutonium and HEU is almost equal to that of China. Now, there was talk of China, adding to its warhead numbers and all that, and that being, and there was also a report recently that by the United States Department of Defense on China's military capabilities that said that eventually China will add to its fissile material stockpile. It stopped producing fissile material, at least the weapons grade materials, many decades ago. But China is working on 2 dual-use breeder reactors. But very interestingly, these reactors started construction around 2017 and 2019, which is at least 2 decades after India started work on its 500 megawatt prototype fast breeder reactor. And India already has plans to add at least 5 more breeder reactors as part of its 3-stage nuclear energy program, which it kept outside safeguards under the India-US deal and the IAEA separation plan. And in order to augment this, it very clearly stated around 2008 that any facility that will be outside safeguards will be linked to its strategic program. That was written in the principles of separation, which was also there in the Indian Embassy website in the United States at the time, but it was later. And in addition to this, India is exponentially increasing its enrichment and reprocessing capacity. The logic behind that is that it requires to reprocess plutonium for the breeder program. But interestingly, it has already separated huge amounts of about 10 tons of plutonium. It only takes about 2 tons of plutonium to fuel 1 breeder reactor, and the first breeder reactor is yet to be commissioned. And once the breeders will start working, then they will produce more fuel than they consume, about 140 kilograms of weapons-grade plutonium each year. So then there is doctrinal transformation. Now, the doctrinal transformation that is occurring is not a coincidence. There is talk of, I think Rajnath Singh had clearly gone to Pokhran a few years ago, and he had said that their NFU doctrine is not etched in stone. Then you look at the language used in the land warfare doctrine and the joint doctrine, like they're talking of preparing for the full spectrum of conflict, even in situations where there is a nuclearized battlefield. And then new types of battlefield ballistic missiles have been added, for example, Prahar and Pralay. And the Pinaka itself, the DRDO has said that they would like to nuclear tip the Pinaka rockets. So this is going to lead to reactor proliferation. I think the Chinese have been very careful, and they, of course, do not recognize India as a nuclear weapon state. So publicly, they do not acknowledge the growing threat perception from India's growing program. But there was a mention in one of the reports by the US Department of Defense, which said a couple of years ago, which said that now India is a factor in China's nuclear planning. And of course, that will force Pakistan and China towards greater emphasis on survivability and dispersal, possibly launch on warning status during a crisis if it pushes further towards conventional or strategic counterforce. And this, I would like to mention here that the decreasing conventional asymmetry, given the two-front war scenario, will become an additional driver for India to rely more on its nuclear potential. So this will lead us to a situation where there will be arms race, crisis, and first strike instabilities in the region. Because damage limitation strategies, especially if it is the way it is being pursued as far as the counterforce component is concerned, reduces mutual vulnerability, which is the basis of deterrence, and undermines the stability of mutual vulnerability, but increases the ability to fight and win a nuclear war in the eyes of an irrational regime, which unfortunately, from a Pakistani viewpoint, is the kind of people that you might find in Indian top places of decision making. And in the final analysis, I think it's a classic case of technology and the growing national power that is driving India's shift in its overall strategy that gives it the flexibility to achieve its offensive goals through a mix of compellence, coercion, escalation, dominance. And it is this huge latent potential that is building up for more than 20 years now that will become the driving force of a revisionist posturing that might undermine the status quo in the region in a future crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now, third speaker of the session is Dr. Adil Sultan. Dr. Adil Sultan is the Dean of the Faculty of Aerospace and Strategic Studies, Acting Chair of Department of Strategic Studies. Before joining the Air University in October 2020, he was a director at the Center for Aerospace and Security Studies and was a visiting research fellow at the Center of Science and Security Studies at the King's College London from 2017 to 2019. He also has been a visiting fellow at the International Institute of Strategic Studies, London in 2015, and a visiting fellow at the Henry L. Stimson Center, Washington, D.C. in 2006. Dr. Sultan has served Pakistan Air Force for 31 years and at the Strategic Plans Division for over 14 years, where he dealt with the arms control, non-proliferation related issues. During his tenure at the SPD, Dr. Sultan served as the Director Arms Control and Disarmament Affairs and Director Research and Analysis at the Policy, Doctrine and Strategy branch of the SPD. His topic of deliberation today is nuclear deterrence, doctrinal ambiguities, misconceptions, and dissonance. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum and good evening. Can you hear me loud and clear?
Yes, we can all hear you loud and clear.
Great. And hopefully you can see me also.
Yes,
first of all, thanks to SVI, and it's good to see the colleagues and seniors sitting over there, Ambassador Zamir Akram, Dr. Mansoor, and other colleagues and friends on virtually joining this session. I was looking at the table and I was thinking, why did I miss this invitation to be physically over there? Because I missed the tea that was being served to the guest over there. But that remains something that I'll come sometime to SVI. So I think much has been said by Dr. Mansoor about nuclear doctrine also, and that makes my job easy. And I also understand that we are 25 minutes behind the schedule. And there are 34 questions to be addressed by the panelists. So this leaves very little time. So I'll try to be as brief as possible because most of the things that I'm going to say are already well known to the participants. Most of the participants, the list I was looking at, they're well conversant, especially the Pakistanis. So this is essentially a Pakistani perspective. So I'll be talking about the ambiguities, misconceptions, and dissonance. These three things, how this affect nuclear deterrence between India and Pakistan. So just listing down some of the factors that are reasons for these ambiguities and misconceptions, dissonance. The ongoing developments that Dr. Mansoor also mentioned briefly, and other participants also mentioned. India's military developments, both conventional and nuclear, and how it plays on the other side amongst the Pakistani decision makers. So some of the ambiguities I'll highlight. And on the Pakistani side, since there is no publicly declared issued document, doctrine that we say, so that is sometimes as taken as if there is no doctrine, which is not correct, but this could be a potential reason for some ambiguities on the other side. I'm talking about the Indian decision makers. Then the misconceptions that we talk mostly between India and Pakistan, these are mostly political in nature due to the distrust between India and Pakistan, and also the perceptions about the international community about this region. They view India and Pakistan differently. And also some of the misconceptions are because of the signals and the statements issued on both the sides. Then we talk about the dissonance. So I would also briefly touch upon the dissonance amongst India's strategic enclave and these talk about whether it's a triad or a dyad or two asymmetric dyads. So that's the debate. Now let me start with the ambiguities, and I'll be quick and just be pointing out, and if there is time for discussion, we can move towards that in detail. India's nuclear doctrine that was made public in 2003, January, it talked about certain things, the credible minimum deterrence. Pakistan also says the same thing, but India has moved rapidly towards building its triad, which includes the sea-based capabilities and multiplying its land-based delivery systems and also the aerial platforms. So this makes it questionable whether it's a minimum or not. Again, a minimum against Pakistan, so it cannot be credible against China because China is a much bigger country, and if they are looking for minimum against China, credible capability against China, that cannot be minimum against Pakistan. So there's a confusion which I think India's decision makers and the scholars are also finding it difficult to explain this credible minimum deterrence posture, whether it's against Pakistan or China, and how to rationalize this. The second was about the no first use posture that India declared by taking this morally high ground that India will retain the no first use posture. But the doctrine that was issued in 2003 had a caveat. It was conditional. It was not unconditional, because it stated that India will retain the right to use nuclear weapon against chemical or biological weapons attack. So we have seen the Syrian context. Who is going to find out whether there was a chemical attack or not? So aggressor state can build a justification for the use of nuclear weapons. Then more importantly, the statements over the past few years that have been coming from India's senior decision makers. And some of those are former members of the National Command Authority, and even the current members of the Nuclear Command Authority, like former Defense Minister, the late Defense Minister Manoj Parrikar, once he was the Defense Minister, and the current Defense Minister. Then India's National Security Advisor and the Commander of India's Strategic Forces. So the number of people, high-ranking officials, both civilian and military, they have publicly articulated that they do not believe in India's no first use posture. So as an adversary, Pakistan, from the Pakistani side, they have to take this seriously, because these statements are not coming from individual scholars or some low-ranking officials. These statements were made by very senior people. Although officially India denied that, they continue to maintain no first use, but these statements contradicting their no first use, their doctrinal position, did create many ambiguities on this side. Then we talk about the technological developments that India is pursuing, like BMD system, Dr. Mansoor has already said, hypersonic glide vehicles, MIRVs, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles that India tested recently also, and the long-range missiles. So all these capabilities, especially the hypersonic glide vehicles, etc. Now, these are the capabilities which can potentially give Indian decision makers the option to launch a preemptive first strike, because they have a PMD system, and the decision makers can possibly think that if we build these capabilities, we can go for a preemptive strike, and Pakistan would be deterred because we have a PMD system. So these developments, once seen in the context of no first use statements also, and the other literature coming up, this creates some ambiguities on this side, that whether India is moving towards that kind of a posture. Then, how much do we know about India's nuclear doctrine? Because Shiv Shankar Menon, in his book Choices, I think he, sorry, not in his book, in his address, he had stated at one time that there are parts of India's nuclear doctrine that had not been made public. So a statement coming from the chairman of the advisory board. So there are some elements that we don't know what India projects as it's publicly its nuclear doctrine. But looking at these statements and the developments, there are concerns that probably the operational and the declaratory doctrine may not be in sync. I'm talking about India. The fourth factor which creates ambiguity is the command and control. The 2017 doctrine that was released by Joint Services Doctrine, it had an organogram in which Strategic Forces Command was under the Chief of Staff Committee, who is now the CDS. So that makes, I did ask this question from one of the former commander of India's strategic forces, why these forces are placed under Chief of Staff Committee. At that time, he said, somebody has to control these strategic forces. So I think that's not a very convincing answer, because globally, once we say the operational control should rest with the political authority, so this ambiguity is over there. Then once we see this BrahMos incident, the recent one, which was also mentioned by one of the panelists, I think this brings a serious question marks, whether it was a conventional or nuclear. It was a strategic missile. And if it was launched by a lower level commander, if we believe, as we were told to believe that a group captain level officer made a mistake. So that raises serious question marks, that how can this authority be delegated to a junior level officer of the rank of group captain? And once we are talking or dealing with the nuclear weapon states. The nuclear submarines is also an issue. Not much is known. Arihan, how nuclear command and control will be maintained. once these submarines would be fully operationalized and there would be an operational deterrence patrol. So that would be a problem. Now, on the Pakistani side, once we talk about ambiguities, although there is no public document that we say as nuclear doctrine, but I think the statements made by senior decision makers and the NCA provide more clarity about the employment or the deployment concepts of what Pakistan is going to do. So that is one thing that many scholars say, that if there would have been a doctrine or publicly available document, that would make more sense. But I think if you have a document, if you are not following, as I believe India is not following, it's better not to declare one, because then you create more confusion amongst your adversaries. Then the second is the ambiguity about the credible minimum deterrence and full spectrum deterrence. Many people term or think that probably Pakistan has moved away from its credible minimum deterrence posture and towards full spectrum deterrence. I think that's something that needs to be understood. I'll not go into detail how it was evolved, but the full spectrum deterrence is not a quantitative term. It was a qualitative response against limited war fighting doctrine of India that Cold Start or the proactive operation strategy is. So if you see the NCA statement, the most recent one, it says Pakistan will maintain full spectrum deterrence posture within the ambit of credible minimum deterrence. So credible minimum deterrence remains a policy, as I believe, and full spectrum deterrence is a posture which is specifically designed to convey a message that there is no space for any kind of a conflict between two nuclear weapon states. Then there is also ambiguity. Many people deliberately raise this, that Pakistan has developed short-range ballistic missiles, and these are also called as tactical nuclear weapons. So by design, it would be pre-delegated to local field commanders. Again, this is a misconception by those who are alleging this, because I think the statements are very clear, and because Pakistan is not United States, so there's a limited territory and limited objective, and these weapons are against specific threat. So all weapons, it has been repeatedly stated that whether it's tactical or strategic weapons, all would be centrally commanded by the NCA. So there is no pre-delegation about that. Now, coming to misconceptions, first I'll talk about India. The first strike versus first use. If you see literature, read literature, many people and the senior decision makers, they have interchangeably used this term first strike and first use. I think that's a term that needs to be clarified and explained more in detail, because both have different connotation. Then in the doctrine, they continue to say that India supports nuclear disarmament, but on the other hand, what Dr. Mansoor also stated, the fissile material production and things like that. Then the important thing, the most, is there is a misconception probably in India, amongst India's decision makers, that since they have conventional superiority, they can wage a limited conventional war under a nuclear environment. So after Balakot 2019, I think that notion must have been addressed. But since all militaries, they continue to develop options, and probably there are not many lessons that can be learned by the Indian decision makers, and there are ongoing efforts to find a space where they can claim that they are conventionally superior power in the region and they can punish a nuclear state. So that's a misconception that needs to be addressed. On the Pakistani side, again, once Pakistan developed these short-range ballistic missiles, there was a concern that Pakistan is probably preparing for nuclear war fighting. Hence, it has developed short-range ballistic missiles. So that's how people started to speculate. I think if somebody understands the concept of full spectrum deterrence, this was the whole objective, was to plug any perceived space for even a limited military conflict. So these weapons remain, the primary purpose remains deterrence. So it's not about nuclear war fighting. We understand between India and Pakistan, any nuclear use would have strategic impact and it would affect both the countries. I think that realization is there amongst the Pakistani decision makers. Then we come to dissonance. Once we talk about the third factor is dissonance amongst India's strategic enclave. If we see the political leadership, the doctrinal development, the concepts that were integrated once they declared this policy, there were more to present India as a responsible nuclear weapon states. But if we see their military, they continue to develop doctrines for limited war fighting without realizing that both India and Pakistan are nuclear weapon states. Any conventional conflict can quickly escalate to an all-out war and possibility of a nuclear use. So they are mostly kept outside the decision-making loop. The political leadership by design, they don't want to integrate conventional military into this. So the operators have been kept outside. The third is the segment amongst the India's strategic enclave is the DRDO phenomena, where the scientists, they're developing ICBMs, they're developing short-range ballistic missiles, they are trying to venture into space or militarization of space. So if you see all these developments that the scientific community is doing, this is not in consonance with their declaratory policy or the doctrine, but they just want to project probably that India has a technological advantage or it can compete with other major powers, especially countries like United States, because they develop hypersonic glide vehicles, because China had built one, Russia had built one, United States had built one. So hence, DRDO had to come up with something. So they built one. Likewise, the anti-satellite weapons. There is not much in the space of Pakistani assets that they can destroy, and they cannot dare to destroy Chinese satellites. But they had to prove themselves that they have this technology and they are at par with other major powers. So the DRDO or the scientific community, they are moving on a entirely different trajectory. So that's the dissonance amongst India's strategic enclave. And it's problematic also because whatever they develop, it does affect Pakistani security perceptions. Now, what needs to be done, just to conclude, there needs to be a clarity. If India wants to deal with China, they can continue doing that, but they have to eventually deal with Pakistan separately because deterrence relationship for now is primarily between India and Pakistan. In the future, we don't know. Yes, as India grows in its size and potential, its interest would change and it might have that kind of capability where it can stand up against China. But for now, India doesn't have that capability. For a foreseeable future, I think this deterrence dynamics or the dyad is going to be India-Pakistan, and we have to deal with this thing. And whatever the ambiguities are, I think if we start this, because in 2004, once we agreed to start this composite dialogue process, there was one element that we need to discuss these issues to remove any ambiguities and bring clarity, because amongst nuclear weapon states, there has to be a degree of clarity about each other's intentions in terms of concepts and capabilities. And for that, it is only possible if we start the confidence building measures or this process. Even if we are adversaries, I think there is a merit in discussing these issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adil. Now, ladies and gentlemen, our fourth and last speaker of today's session is Dr. Nasir Hafiz. Dr. Nasir Hafiz is Director of Research at the SVI Islamabad. He has been associated with SVI since April 2022. Dr. Nasir holds a PhD from Department of International Relations, National Defense University, Islamabad. He has been associated with Syed Johns Hopkins University as a visiting research associate in South Asian Studies Center as well. His published research papers in research journal and participated in various national and international seminars and conferences. His research areas are national, international security, nuclear strategy, nuclear diplomacy, non-proliferation, arms control, disarmament, discourse analysis, and strategic foresight and scenario planning. And today his topic will be strategic stability in South Asia. So over to you, sir.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thanks for giving me this opportunity to speak along with such an eminent panel of scholars and before such an eminent gathering of physical as well as virtual audience. I'm aware that this is the last session of this webinar, and I'm also aware that I am the last speaker. So I preempted this situation right at the beginning, and I'm not going to speak a lot, and I'm going to cut everything short. And I do take the advantage of other speakers, those who have already covered a long subject area, which I had to cover. So I'll take that advantage and don't repeat anything else. I'm going to be slightly innovative and would produce something which is slightly new. And would present that framework of analysis, which of course is written in practice, but it is slightly not used in our own strategic community. We do understand that strategic stability has been the focus of scholars working in the field of nuclear deterrence ever since the onset of the nuclear revolution. As we all know, this term has a history and an evolution in the Cold War. South Asia can draw lessons from this experience, but cannot emulate that. The long-standing Kashmir territorial dispute between India and Pakistan, the close proximity, the conflicting identities and history of use of force makes South Asia situation slightly different, rather completely different. We have to be cognizant of the fact that we are confronted with rapidly changing and highly complex environment, which is shaping multi-layered reality across different dimensions and multiple perspectives. Interacting with such a reality in such a challenging time, we need very complex tools. It is simple solutions. They are not simple solutions to these complex problems. So in order to approach this strategic stability and the concept of peace in South Asia, I have tried to use the causal layer analysis. This helps us look at such a reality of employing 4 layers of different perspectives. So I'm going to augment my friend Ali's perspective of looking at the level of analysis, and here is a causal layer analysis. So it seeks to unravel the layers of popular thinking and to inquire deeper into its many levels, from systemic understanding to those of discourses and worldviews, and finally leading us to the myths and metaphors which are created by the culture. At the level of the litany, it looks at the popular imagination, often undifferentiated and monolithic, which presents often an impervious understanding of a contrary viewpoint. It is generally the public perception right at the top of the situation. Below this layer is the layer of systemic causes, an expert level view of the political, cultural, societal, and historical factor of an issue along with some empirical evidence. So the level 2 is based on data. This is the social causes, historical factors of an issue along with some empirical evidence. The level of litany and the systemic cause narratives can be viewed as shallow empiricist and anecdotal exposition of the deeper worldviews. The worldviews legitimate the 2 layers of litany and systemic causation. The inclusion or exclusion of a particular discourse can eventually privilege the issue and the consequent scenarios that may emerge. This allows inclusion of other perspectives or epistemologies. The level that follows worldview is that of unconscious and subconscious myths and metaphors. Myths create a sacrosanct image of the future, which structures and presupposes the perceptions and the worldviews, and hence a person's experience of the world. This level is deepened on specific civilizational and cultural underpinning about the nature of time, rationality, and agency. With this brief introduction of CLA, that is the causal layer analysis, let us look at the South Asian situation. First of all, I'll try to describe the Pakistani perspective, followed by an Indian perspective, and finally the way forward of a balanced, desired perspective. So if you look at the slide, on one side, I have tried to describe different levels, that is litany, systemic, worldview, and a metaphor. At the level of the litany, it is assumed that within Pakistan, there's a broader consensus that India is an enemy state and trying to undo Pakistan. everything that goes wrong in Pakistan is the making of Indians, and India is basically has not accepted the partition as such. Pakistan Army is considered as the guardian of independence and national security. Kashmir being the jugular vein and the unfinished agenda of Pakistan, and Pakistan is considered incomplete without the accession of Kashmir. Pakistan should employ its military forces and nuclear weapons. There is a general perception, if we have a lot of military force and if we have the nuclear weapons, why not to liberate Kashmir? At a systemic level, it is recognized that there is a history of conflict and animosity between the two states. India reluctantly accepted partition as a temporary arrangement and constantly pursuing policies and strategies to undo partition. India is illegally occupying Kashmir along. Now, let me tell you, this is the Pakistani perspective. I am trying to put here two perspectives, one after the other. So first of all, let's look at the Pakistani side of the argument. These are the discourses which do exist here. Some may agree, some may not agree, but this is the broader, I've tried to collect everything put together. So at the end of the presentation, I can still, I'm ready to listen to, and you have all the liberties to disagree with me. India is illegally occupying Kashmir against the popular will of the people and is in violation of the United Nations Security Resolution. Pakistan should engage India on the basis of sovereign equality without recognizing Indian regional hegemony. Strategic stability in the region will be maintained at all costs. This is the desire. Policy of full spectrum deterrence has successfully closed the doors of limited war below the nuclear threshold. Indo-US partnership to prepare India as a counterweight to China is in fact enhancing India's military capability against Pakistan. So this systemic analysis is presented at one way or the other by one scholar or the other in Pakistan. And what drives this systemic analysis is the worldview. And first and the foremost worldview in Pakistan, you may not agree with that, but this is what is the reality, that Islam is in danger. Pakistan is the fortress of Islamic identity and the last warrior to save Islam. Wherever there's a challenge against Islam, it is the Pakistanis are there and they are required to go there. There's a lot of holiness attached to the creation of Pakistan, that it was created in the month of the Ramadan, on the 27th of Ramadan. It was actually not there in 1947. It came up a little later. Pakistan is the victim of the narrative of the clash of civilization, especially after 9/11, and there are all the time conspiracies going on against Pakistan. And last, I think there is another kind of a superiority complex in Pakistani, that Pakistanis are superior as compared to the Hindu Banyas. And then they are the superior martial race with strong strategic culture. If we look at the last portion here, which drives the culture of which drives the discourse at the level of the culture, is basically the representation of Pakistani nation with the Iqbal ka Shaheen. Basera kar pahadon ki chatanon par. Yani ki stay away from the power politics and live the life of fakr. Disregard the material reality and try to assume the spiritual reality. Symbol of traditional Islamic heritage and epitome of Islamic identity. Who thinks, that there is a requirement, there is a superiority complex in an Islamic strategic culture that Hindu Banya is an inferior and cannot fight Muslims. But what happened in 1971, there's a history to that. But there is also a lesson learned from 71 is that never again syndrome, that this kind of defeat should not happen again. So that drives the strategic culture as a myth in Pakistan. So now with these 4 levels this is not the comprehensive way of looking at the Pakistani total strategic culture, but this is just a glimpse of that. And similarly, now I'm going to present before you the Indian perspective on what actually is happening between India and Pakistan and what they think of Pakistan. This is based on the literature review, what literature we have. And I would request our friend from India that you can disagree with that and put us wise at the end of this discussion that where we are going wrong or where I think we can correct on this understanding of India again about the situation. The first, at the litany level, we think that Muslims are considered as Malich, and that it basically represent foreigners and barbarians. Muslims are considered as the lapsed Hindus, or Ghar Wapsi, the policy that they do not, they had to be reconverted back. Muslims do not respect the Hindu culture, the Gau Mata, the slaughter of the Gau Mata. And if they do not want to respect the Hindu culture, they should leave India and go to Pakistan. And India is only for Hindus. This is increasingly developing in India. At a systemic level, it is generally believed that Pakistan, it is projected also. And the last book which I read about the Ashley Telesway, who has written about asymmetries in South Asia, he says that, and mostly it is projected that Pakistan is a revisionist state, trying to redraw the map, the borders. Holding on Kashmir is important for Indian secular identity, and any concession on Kashmir will trigger cessationist tendencies in India. This is what we think that Indians believe, and that is how they are negotiating on Kashmir. India has the right to great power status, which has long been denied. And it should be dehyphenated from Pakistan, and it should try and attempt to isolate Pakistan as much as possible. And it is believed in India that Pakistan takes advantage of its nuclear weapons and pursue sub-conventional war of attrition against India. India has the military capability. This confidence do exist in India that it has the capability to punish Pakistan by launching and winning limited war below nuclear threshold, the Cold Star Doctrine, along with certain other coercive options which they have recently practiced. India needs to counter Pakistan by supporting dissident groups to accelerate the implosion or the decay of the state. India is facing two-war front with China and Pakistan, and China is engaged in building Pakistan to counter India as its plan B. So this what systemic analysis in the Indian literature is basically driven by the worldview, which in my view is based on the Indian Brahmin supremacist worldview. Indian Brahmin supremacy and Indian centrality in the world. They think that the world revolves around India. This is what the Brahmin supremacy worldview dictates. And then as I read Jaswant Singh, and he says that India feels insult even when it is not intended or directed towards us because of the centuries of servitude. First, initially under the Muslims, and then under the British. So this produces a strange sense of fear and strategic fear in India of not, like Pakistan of 71, not letting this thing to happen again. Then that is the reason they jealously guard their autonomy and independence. They do not want this thing to happen again. They do not fear Pakistan alone to overcome and take over India, but they fear that together with Afghanistan and Iran, there is likelihood that there can be a collusion or alliance of certain states, and that is how India has laid a lot of emphasis on its policy towards Afghanistan and Iran to keep it away from Pakistan. That drives its Afghan policy and Iran's policy. What is the metaphor for India to approach to understand or to drive these discourse? It is basically the mother India. It considers partition as Batwara. Batwara normally is between the inheritance of one parent, So India thinks that this is mother India is a one single whole, and somehow the other, the Muslims have taken a portion of it, which should be reverted back. And then another metaphor also explains the behavior of Indian strategic enclave, that is, that Pakistan follows death to India by 1,000 cut. That is the understanding with the metaphor which I have tried to approach the Indian perspective. Now, these two perspectives in our right in front of us, let us look at some of the possibilities which can be explored to mellow down the situation or to have a way forward and stabilize South Asia as it is, I think, always desired by and should be desired by both the countries. At the literary level, I think there is a greater requirement of depoliticizing the rhetoric of animosity. Both sides, India and Pakistan, are two separate states in the region with different identities and objectives, and it is absolutely normal and it should happen, and there's nothing wrong about that. But they have a large population living below the poverty line. That is substantial, and they need to be worried about that. There are disputes between the two nations which can be resolved. And there are always ways, and there are always examples in the history where the nations with disputes have come together and resolved their disputes. Having dispute is not a problem. Now, with this litany in the public that these disputes are not unsurmountable or unresolvable, and they are resolvable, we need to look at the systemic factors. I hurriedly go through these systemic factors that the Muslims and Hindus are two separate identities which have history of peaceful coexistence and harmony. They have never been at war, always. There have been a great era where they were living together. Pakistan and Muslims are not an obstacle to Indian great power status. Stability in the region is in mutual interest of both the countries. Interference in internal affairs may lead to conflict escalation and should be avoided. Road to peace between India and Pakistan certainly pass through Kashmir, which can be resolved without redrawing maps, and there are options already on the table. Nuclearization of South Asia has contributed positively towards elimination of war. Coercive options or limited war below nuclear threshold are dangerous. Both countries can pursue independent development trajectories without undermining each other's potential, and they rather can complement each other by increasing mutual trade and allowing access to Central Asian market. As a worldview, the extremism and terrorism of all kinds is a menace which should be dealt with collectively by both the countries. We should not give chance to few non-state actors, individuals to take and to hijack whatever peaceful activities or peaceful endeavors are being made. Islam is not a threat to international peace. This has to be acknowledged. Muslim rule in India has contributed positively to the development of Indian society, and this has to be highlighted. Partition of subcontinent is now a fact of life and cannot be undone. There should not be unnecessary fear within Pakistan also. And territorial disputes can be solved peacefully. So with this, this is some of the ideas of working for the way forward. As far as the metaphor is concerned, I have really tried my best and could not come up with any good metaphor. So I would suggest that I'm looking forward to the participants to help me find a suitable metaphor for that. And I would be thankful to you for that. To conclude, I will only say that South Asia got rid of the physical structures of the colonialism in 1947. But they are still struggling with the divide and rule principle and other tools of new imperialism. We need to work together, and I think the collective energies of our people are sufficient to solve the problem of South Asia. With this, I am. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Naiman. Please, with your permission, sir, may I take few questions because we have 29 questions in the question and answer session?
You can pick and choose, and we can have about 15 minutes of questions.
Okay, I've already combined few of the questions which I'm going to pose to the panel. Dr. Tang, for you, there are few of the questions which I have compiled, and I think the more audience wanted to know, what is the AUKUS implication for China's strategic interest? Many of those people want to know about this, so I would be grateful if you could share your opinion on it.
Club it together, 3-4.
Sir, what side of us? Professor Dr. Wu Zuitang, please. Can you hear me?
Sorry, is a question to me or just
Yes.
to the speakers?
Yes, this question is referring to you because people want to know that what is the AUKUS implications for China's strategic interest. There are many questions regarding AUKUS and Chinese interest. So I would like you to answer that. Thank you.
I mean, the Chinese strategic trust with India or USA? I mean,
AUKUS.
AUKUS, it's regarding AUKUS. AUKUS
oh,
deal.
August. Sorry, August. Yeah. Yes, it's I don't think China. I think first we have to look at the AUKUS. The AUKUS is a group of military alliance. From Chinese perspective, it's not only traditional military power, but also seems to go into a nuclear power group, nuclear power alliance. So it's a kind of instability to the whole the Asia Pacific, not only to China. I imagine just when the U.S. nuclear submarine appeared in South China Sea, and then the U.S. military strategic weapons launched across the U.S. the whole Asia Pacific continent, and then the AUKUS nuclear submarines, and even more, maybe the U.S. will deploy nuclear warheads over there. So imagine this is a place. This is a place that makes the whole region should be very look at carefully and look at how the USA is going to do to make the whole region to affect to have a military conflict particularly between China and the whole West, or just make the Southeast Asian countries, make the India, make the other countries who want to have economic development, even including ASEAN and Southeast Asian countries. They want more, I think, focus more economic development, not kind of military conflict. So that is why China, I think, oppose this kind of AUKUS intentions that want to make this region to have maybe a kind of hub of a military conflict, even nuclear deterrence, nuclear capability, nuclear threats. So this is the one that's not only less trust between China and your United States, but also I think it's kind of strategic distrust between the whole the West and the China. And imagine, and have of course look at the whole East Asian countries. Do they really think that is kind of a military or even nuclear deterrence, nuclear threats, a kind of a scenario makes they feel safe? I don't think so. So the less trust, I think this trust between the China and the USA, and even China lacks of this distrust with the USA, I think now we have to look at the first, who is the source that makes this region more dangerous. I think that's why I mentioned in my speech that the ASEAN countries know clearly the US military presence, military deployment, and military aggression in the last year, in the 2021 and 2022, makes this region, I think, more dangerous because China have to react. So we cannot really say that this is China wants to, because China have to focus on our national security with vitals over Taiwan or issues. So China is react. So we have to look at who is the chicken, who is the egg, So that is, I think, to look at the China USA the distrust between each other is the whole phenomenon for all of us to think about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. There is also many questions about how Pakistan should balance between the global contemporary powers. So I would like Chair to refer this question to anyone.
I think Ambassador Veerakram is.
Okay, so there's been a lot of talk in Pakistan about having balanced relations between the United States and China, or even with Russia. Personally, it's good to have this kind of declaratory policy, having balanced relations, and that's an admirable thing to do. However, the problem is that in this toxic global environment, which is characterized by this war in Ukraine, and the confrontation or the tensions over Taiwan between the three major powers, I don't think that it is realistic to actually expect to successfully maintain balanced, so-called balanced relations, number one. Number two, I think it's only the major powers that can really afford to have balanced relations with smaller and lesser powers. The powers like Pakistan, India, and others need to have the ability to protect their interests as best they can. Now, in Pakistan's case, of course, as I mentioned in my presentation, I think the choice is very clear and it's very stark. And the choice is for Pakistan to further deepen and broaden its traditional, historical, strategic partnership with China for the simple reason that it is only with China that there is a strategic convergence that exists between Pakistan and China at the present time. I don't see that there is any strategic convergence between Pakistan and the United States. I mean, I know that my friend and colleague, Ambassador Masood in Washington, has recently engaged in efforts to try and build up some kind of agenda for the Pakistan-US relationship, and there have been several seminars in Washington on this. But basically, to put it, I mean, I think what it seems is that they are talking about developing relations to the US to help us promote agriculture, help us promote our energy, which is all fine. It's not, but these are not strategic convergences. These are not deep-rooted security-related convergences between Pakistan and the United States. They don't exist anymore. I would argue that I want to put myself out there for criticism also by saying that we have only one choice, and that's China.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. There is another question in which 2 or 3 questions which I've compiled, which talks about the strategic balance in the South Asia. And what is the preemptive deterrence in South Asian perspective? The question is asked by Mr. Muzaffar Ahmed Mir here.
Preemptive deterrence?
Preemptive deterrence in South Asian perspective.
Sorry.
In the context of South Asian perspective, is there an answer? Or?
Well, from what I understand is that as long as you maintain a credible level of deterrence, that will sufficiently that should be sufficient to prevent the other side from taking advantage and from risk manipulation, basically. And for that, you need to have balanced conventional forces. As I understand full spectrum deterrence, there is a nuclear component to it, and then there is also a corresponding conventional component to it. And that is what all major nuclear powers have been doing. They've been the pace of the conventional modernization that is going on everywhere, and especially in South Asia, is unprecedented. And along with the nuclear modernization and expansion. So all countries have been investing in that because you want to have war-fighting options on the conventional side, and then you need to keep your deterrence at par with the changing regional dynamic and threat perception.
So Dr. Adil Sultan may like to add.
Can I just say something here?
Yes.
Look, preemptive deterrence is deterrence. Exactly. I mean, there is no such thing as preemptive deterrence. You have a capability which is credible, or it should be credible, in order for it to be able to deter your enemy or enemies. So that is, I think it is an
Actually, term is not correct. It is an incorrect term.
I have a couple. My name is Mohammad Samad. I'm a senior research fellow at the Army Institute of Military History here. I have a couple of observations with regards to the emerging technologies in BMD by India. I would like your comments on the Pakistani developments as well, if very briefly, sir, Dr. Mansoor. Also, when you talk about India and China and breeder reactors and all of these different measures that China and India are developing but there's a lot of talk with regards to, rather a lot of criticism when we talk about China. And due to the lack of any sort of reprimand that India receives, any sort of rebuke that India receives, naturally the West chooses to ignore Indian developments, and not only that, they're also helping augment India's capabilities as well. So that is another observation that I had to make. With regards to China, Professor Gao Zedong, he talked about the issues in Taiwan. I would like some comments from him on the issue of the artificial islands that are being made in the South China Sea, how he perceives the threat emanating from the American side, and what exactly does he think of the concerns that other states in China's south, around the South China Sea, how does China perceive them? How does China look at them as well? Thank you.
Yes, sir.
So very quickly, I think India will never be able to build a foolproof BMP system that will cover all its territory and that will be able to intercept all the incoming missiles. This is a BMD system. It is not credible to intercept. It doesn't have the capacity to intercept cruise missiles. So what Pakistan has already done, the Ababil test, was in anticipation of what India was doing in response to that. So that is the way forward. The other thing is the development of hypersonic systems. I think the first thing that Pakistan needs to do is to move from subsonic to supersonic cruise missiles, because what you've seen in Ukraine is that the Western supplied air defense systems and other with the situational awareness that they've had, they have been successful at intercepting a large number of subsonic Russian cruise missiles. So that should be a point of concern. And the third thing is that eventually, I mean, there were reports that Pakistan was working on a hypersonic missile system. So Pakistan will also need to go down the hypersonic route. So this is the natural progression that has the technological pathway that every country eventually has to follow, and that is the way forward. But then there are other things also. You need to have a very good ISR target acquisition capability. You need to have more robust survivable forces against a decapitating strike, and eventually that's going to put pressure on your force requirements and force goals as to what kind and of warheads and the number of warheads that you would within the framework of credible minimum deterrence. So very briefly, that's.
So I think to add to that, what Mansoor has said, I want to add the ability to have a credible ASAT capability as well, going down in the future, because the Indians have already demonstrated that capability. And if they are able to unilaterally have the capability to destroy satellites, which are important for command control, communications, targeting, all those things, then we'll be extremely vulnerable. And the only way to deter that is to have your own ASAT capability. So that is part of what we need to do in terms of BMD.
So Dr. Adil, you had to share a few remarks, so please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I took the advantage and a teacher within me couldn't stop. So I've already answered 8-10 questions by typing. So I hope.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Doctor.
Because it's important to indulge everybody in the debate, and they have been patiently waiting for responses to their questions. About preemptive deterrence, just it's an interesting term, but deterrence is always preemptive because you prepare your capability to deter an adversary. So it has to be preemptive. So it's not something new. It's the inherent characteristic of a deterrence. On hypersonic light vehicles, I'll slightly purely academic discussion. If we make an argument, hypersonic light vehicle for India will not work for Pakistan. So likewise, similar kind of a technology probably will not work for Pakistan against India. One. Secondly, you need to see the objectives. If you're not going for a preemptive first strike, a counter force strike, you don't have that kind of a posturing. So why to go that route? Because then it would add pressures. And the criticism that we do about the India's DRDO and the scientific community that they continue to build solutions, they have money to waste. Do you have money to waste? I think we should be careful about these things, because just because India has built something, we need to build a similar kind of a thing. Would you be able to integrate into your posture? Yes, if it is your posture, then by all means go ahead. But if you can do without it and you are effectively doing it, why to introduce something which is going to further destabilize and put burden on your national exchequer? That's my personal point of view.
If I may say something about, there has been this discussion of subsonic, supersonic, and hypersonic systems. My point of view is that the quality of cruise missiles, the stealth capability, is because if it is in the subsonic mode. We have seen recently after this BrahMos incident that to maintain a supersonic speed and to reach the desired range it is intended to reach, it has to fly at a much higher altitude, which means that the stealth capability and radar evading capability is then compromised. And if it is flying at 40,000 feet, it can be it can be detected at very long distances. In this case, as it happened, it could be detected for over 100 miles away. So there are not all the positives associated with the speed alone. And secondly, if you increase the speed of the cruise missile, it also impacts its payload carrying capability. So the supersonic missiles can carry much shorter payload. Its range is much more limited. Just compare the characteristics of BrahMos with Tomahawk, which is half the weight of that BrahMos missile, but it can achieve 4 times more range and it carries double the weight of payload. So those are the advantages of the subsonic missiles, and the kind of systems which were given to Ukraine by the West. I think they are the cutting edge technology which they wanted to test there. Mostly, I think most of the drones which have been shot down and the cruise missiles, it has not been with the conventional weapons, but with the directed energy weapons like high-powered lasers. So I think as far as India is concerned, this as of now, they do not have that kind of capability. And also, the overall performance of Russian military and the Russian weapon system which they have used in Ukraine has not been something to be proud of. And I think if we start drawing lessons from the Ukraine conflict, there may be some wrong lessons learned there. So that is what I wanted to add to this.
Thank you, Dr. Salik. With this, I would like to end the second session, and I would also like to request all the speakers if they want to share something within a minute or two from the. So the floor is yours, and you can go one by one. Dr. Adil Sultan, if you have.
Dr. Ali.
Dr. Ali Ahmed, sorry. Dr. Ali Ahmed, please.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I want to respond to Dr. Hafiz. He asked for a metaphor for the last slide that he had encapsulated on the strategic cultural perspectives in South Asia. I want to offer Think South Asia. Professor, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dr. Adil Sultan, please, sir.
No, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I think I've already said enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Professor Gu Zuitang, if you have any comment to add, please.
Thank you very much. It's an excellent seminar, and I really learned a lot. Just a few words over the last question about our South China Sea. This is I have the 3 points. First, the very complicated relationship between China and ASEAN countries, culturally, histories, and politically, militarily, many. So this is the first point. Second is many people talk about China's, just mentioned it, China's military equipment, military equipment, militarization of the South China Sea Islands over there. It's artificial island over there, but nobody knows that how many Vietnam and Philippines, they occupied and claimed this kind of South China Sea Island. And the problem is, before the 2016, the USA and other, the Philippines and Vietnam, they occupied actually much of the South China Sea Island over there, and nobody cares about that. So when China is going to talk about that, it's doing more, so it will be really flawed. So what's the problem? It's the China-US military, this strategic competition brings this. As I said, this is the US strategy. It can take South China Sea as one of the key problem that can make these ASEAN countries counterbalance China's role. So it's not surprising. The last point is, if you look at the ASEAN country and China, all of them actually want to talk regionally and solve the problem multilaterally, but not with the outsiders, the USA, Japan, and others who are outside, who are not involved in this border or island disputes. But what's the problem? So this is three, I think we have, all of us have to look at the history, the present situation, how the US think about this, why this issue bring about, can be a hot spot in last almost 10 years. So this is the question. Thank you very much. I just use it 2 or 1 or 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing Chinese perspective with us. Now I would like to request Dr. Mansoor, if you have any comment, please share.
Well, I think I've said enough, but I'd like to offer my deep appreciation and gratitude for this opportunity. And it's really good to interact with international experts, and we should continue to have such exchanges. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Ambassador Zamir. I'm sorry. Thank you. Now I would like to give the. Okay, sir, please, Dr. Nasir, please. Sorry.
Thank you very much. I think why I took the podium, because I want to thank Ali for suggesting think South Asia is very important, and I really appreciate. I think it can be a workable solution for the way forward. But for that to happen, I think we need to talk to each other, to think collectively. So I think there is a greater requirement of looking at the issues of South Asia from the South Asian perspective. And I think we need to build scholarship on South Asian perspective rather than Western experts writing on South Asia, and we being driven by a discourse which has its own interest. That interest is basically that interest originates from our historical experience of colonialism. So that white man's burden should be thrown away, and I think let's take our burden together. So I think this is the beginning of that activity. So we look forward for further engagements with you also and with the experts from across the border. So I would certainly, I appreciate the level of analysis which you presented. I would certainly look into this, the framework, and would certainly also request you also to look into my framework, how we can bridge them together. Thank you very much, sir. And I also thank all the participants, and also thank the participants, virtual online participants. Really, they are the one for whom we should all, I think, be thankful to them, because this event has been a success because of their presence. So thank you all the virtual participants as well.
Now, sir, now I would like to request Dr. Naeem Salik, sir, please give the concluding remarks, sir.
I think at this time of the evening, I would only appreciate the patience and perseverance of the participants who took out time and participated in this event, especially the speakers for very enlightening presentations, and all our friends from abroad, from India, from China, from the other places, and all those participants who participated virtually. This has been a very useful activity, and we hope to continue doing such activities in future as well. And once again, thank you very much. And I am glad that with such eminent experts on the panels, we were still able to control the discussion and have not gone overstepped by more than 17 minutes. And for that, the credit goes to the moderator. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, especially the virtual participants and discussants, panelists. Thank you so much. And with this, we will be ending our webinar. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.